Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back through time to a place you've probably never heard of, Helike, a Greek port city that once gleamed like a pearl on the Gulf of Corinth. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're cozying up, drop a comment below telling me what city you're in and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off a small wooden skiff onto a creaking dock that glows with the last gold of sunset. The planks throb beneath your sandals as you inhale the sharp tang of sea salt intertwined with the earthy aroma of newly baked bread. Around you, merchants pack away woven baskets stuffed with rosy apples and dusty figs, while fishwives sling their catch, gleaming sardines and dark, mottled grouper, into shallow wicker trays. One vendor, a squat man with a bristly beard, calls out, "Try the amberjack. It's so fresh it still remembers swimming." You laugh at his theatrics, resisting the urge to taste. Yet you already know your future self will give in. Beyond the immediate bustle, sleek triremes lean lazily against stone piers. Their prows bear carved figures of lions, gripping bronze-rimmed shields. You press a palm against one hull. The wood is still pliant from recent maintenance. Mainstream historians agree that by the mid-4th century BCE, Helike served as the principal naval base of the Achaean League, with as many as 24 warships docked here at any time. Yet in scrappy pocket guides for tourists, even though none come here anymore, a passing mention speculates Helike's fleet may have also acted as a private militia for wealthy merchants. Historians are still debating this question. As twilight deepens, torches flicker on stone lampposts, casting weaving shadows over the marketplace's back alleys. You squeeze between two columns draped in salt-stained ropes, and the sudden hush feels a tad ominous, until a fishmonger's cry shatters it. "Get your moray eels," he shouts, guaranteed to spark passion or at least a good dinner conversation. You wrinkle your nose. Rumor says this particular species of moray, now extinct, was prized as an aphrodisiac so potent that youth groups in Corinth would smuggle it across the Gulf under cover of darkness. Oddly enough, such fish aren't mentioned in the surviving recipes of Apicius, fueling speculation that eel lovers preferred oral traditions over written ones. Historians are still debating whether the erotic elixirs were mainstream or underground. You wander farther, drawn by the scent of roasted chickpeas, slightly sweet and dusted in spicy herbs. A rosy-cheeked vendor scoops them from a clay jar, smiling as you sample a handful. The flavor jolts your senses, earthy, nutty, with a faint tang of something floral. Curious, you ask her secret. She leans in conspiratorially, whispering that she waters the chickpea vines with spring water drawn from beneath the temple of Artemis. "Blessed by the goddess herself," she says, before they even laid the first stone for her altar. You raise an eyebrow at the tall tale but can't deny the extraordinary taste is worth every grain of salt. Just beyond the chickpea stall, olive oil barrels stand like emerald sentinels. Light filters through dappling leaves of an old olive tree overhead, painting the barrels in shifting patterns. You lift a lid and inhale the fragrance. Grassy, peppery, with a warm undertone that speaks of sun-soaked groves miles inland. An old sailor leans in, tipping his weathered cap. "That oil," he says in hushed tones, "is pressed by monks in Mount Helmos. They say each drop whispers prayers during pressing." Whether pious ritual or savvy marketing, you decide it's the kind of legend worth believing, if only for the romanticism. Your stomach growls. Dinner options beckon. You spot a tavern's lantern-lit entrance ahead, its painted sign, an amphora tilted over a wave, swaying slightly. Inside, long wooden benches cradle patrons who lean in close, voices conspiratorial. You slide onto a stool, greeted by a server with soot-smudged forehead and a grin that suggests she's heard every possible joke about tourists. She plunks down a goblet of dark wine that smells of figs and wild herbs. You take a sip, smooth, warm, and potent enough to straighten the spine of any wandering philosopher. Quick tip: Helike's wine merchants once experimented with mixing seawater into their vintages, believing it enhanced flavor, though modern palates tend to disagree. As you sip, you eavesdrop on local banter. Three merchants argue about the price of ambergris shipped from Lesbos. A pair of young scribes compare meager pay for inscribing funeral epitaphs. And in the corner, a grizzled veteran describes the sound of oars at dawn, creaking like the ribs of a sleeping beast. One merchant jokes, "Keep your beard trimmed, or Artemis might snip it for you," drawing hearty laughter. You can't help but join in, momentarily forgetting you're a mere traveler in the crowd. When the laughter fades, you press your face against a latticed window looking out to the quay. A lone lamp glows atop the lighthouse tower, a spiraling wooden structure that guides ships at night. You count its slats, noting one that seems fresher than the others. Obscure detail. Some historians suggest early wooden lighthouses used resin-infused lumber for fire resistance, though there's little physical evidence remaining. You file that under may be true. Rising from your seat, you venture back into the open air. The night breeze is cool, carrying the low chant of temple bells from across town. You follow the bell's melody until you reach the temple of Artemis Sotyra, its white marble columns pale in torchlight. You run your fingers along carved lotus motifs, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims. A faint red pigment clings to one carving, possibly a remnant of ritual paint or an early restoration attempt. No one's quite sure. Stepping inside, the stone floor is cool beneath your feet. The flicker of oil lamps dances on the walls, revealing faded murals of sea creatures and crescent moons. You crouch to read a partially eroded inscription. To Artemis, guardian of waves and wanderers. You imagine ancient worshippers leaving offerings, maybe a strand of wool or a pottery bowl. At the goddess's feet, praying for safe passage. A senior priest, his robes saffron-stained and hair silver, murmurs prayers you can't decipher. You stand respectfully in silence, feeling the weight of tradition pressing gently on your shoulders. Leaving the temple, you find a small courtyard with stone basins carved into dolphin shapes. Each basin holds a trickle of seawater, likely channeled in from tidal pools. Some archaeologists think these basins were used to mix seawater with wine for libations. Others argue it's too impractical and suggest they were decorative pleas to Poseidon instead. Historians are still debating this question. You dip a finger into the basin. The water is cold, salty, and oddly comforting. As you wander back toward the docks, you pass rows of modest houses built from sun-baked bricks, their flat roofs strewn with drying figs and clay tiles. Laundry, white tunics and colorful cloths, swings on lines overhead, rustling like soft sails in the breeze. Children with dusty knees chase each other barefoot, shrieking with delight as they weave between feet. Closer to the harbor, you notice a gathering of fishermen unpacking their nets. Their haul tonight includes glistening octopus, scorpion fish with spiky fins, and even a rare jewel-like sea urchin prized by healers for its supposed medicinal properties. One angler teases another about his catch being too soft to eat, prompting hoots of laughter. You offer to help untangle a knot. He accepts, and you spend a few minutes learning the art of net mending, the rough rope cutting gentle slices into your fingertips. Finally, you arrive back at the spot where you started. The last rays of sunset have given way to starlight reflected in the rippling water. Lanterns bob along the piers, and the gentle lap of waves against hulls. You push through a narrow alleyway where the fragrant haze of crushed coriander and saffron hangs thick in the humid morning air. Sunlight filters between the gaps of uneven timber stalls, spotlighting heaped pyramids of spices in every hue: golden turmeric, burnt umber zeater, and flaming red chili flakes imported from the distant sands of Lydia. You weave past a burlap sack half submerged under a stall's canopy, where a small child naps beside a pile of green cardamom pods, their husks whispering as the breeze stirs them. The pungent aroma assaults you in the best possible way, every breath an invitation to adventure. Ahead, a line of fishmongers has laid out their morning catch on wooden planks stained pale blue by seawater. Mullet glint like wet coins. Squid dangle by tentacles, ink sacks still plump. You pause at one stall where a stout woman with salt-crisped hair brandishes a greytack-sized tuna head and hollers, "See the eyes!" Still dreaming of the deep. Her voice reverberates against nearby amphorae stacked like sentinels. Mainstream historians agree that Helike's marketplace was the busiest hub between Patras and Corinth, drawing traders from as far east as Ionia by the 5th century BCE. You marvel at the claim as you reach out to trace the curved ridges of a mackerel's vertebrae, ice cold to the touch. A merchant to your right is busy scraping scales off a freshly beheaded octopus, its suction cups curling theatrically. He uses a razor-sharp shell as a knife, humming a tune you recognize vaguely from a chorus of oarsmen you heard the night before. You comment on his tool choice. He laughs, telling you he scavenged it from a sunken wreck not far from the shoreline, an old trireme he swears sank in a skirmish with pirates. That detail stands out. Archaeologists are still debating whether Helike's harbor walls once successfully repelled sea people raids, or if the city's naval strength lay solely in its fleet. On your left, you spot barrels half-submerged in seawater brine, filled with pickled sea bass and olives pressed under flat stones. The olives glisten oily, plump with the salty kiss of the Gulf. A wizened old man with a crutch counters your gaze. He offers you a brined olive, then leans closer and whispers that these olives are cured in vats once used for garum, a pungent fish sauce beloved by Romans centuries later, though its precursor here was arguably sharper and fermented with more herbs. You bite down. Your face puckers at the sour-sweet tang. Unbeknownst to many, this early garum precursor was traded as a luxury item as far north as Thessaly, though evidence is scant and scholars still argue whether Helike truly exported it or if later Roman Germans retroactively attributed its origin here. The path widens into the main square. A columned fountain spurts clear water from a carved lion's head, feeding a shallow stone basin where travelers dip their hands. Basil leaves and mint sprigs float on its surface, releasing their essential oils in the humid air. Merchants crowd around, cupping water to rinse the grime from their wares. You do the same, letting the cool droplets chase away the grit from your fingertips. Nearby, a scribe perched on a low stool invites you to inspect a fresh leather scroll inscribed with names of recent imports. Tin from Iberia, cedar from Phoenicia, and even lapis lazuli from lands beyond the eastern horizon. You pause, reading the runic-like script and marveling at how interconnected the ancient world really was. A bell clangs from a raised platform behind the fountain. You follow the sound and find a crier in a bright red cloak pounding his staff on the wooden dais. He's reading aloud announcements. A forthcoming delivery of grain from Sicily, a new tax decree on imported ambergris, and a public feast scheduled for the next full moon in honor of Poseidon. You overhear someone mutter that ambergris, whale-stranded lumps once prized for perfume, is infamous for yielding unpredictable aromas. Obscure fact: locals say Helike once substituted sheep fat for ambergris in a pinch, much to the chagrin of visiting traders. Historians are still debating how widespread such substitutions were and whether they constituted outright fraud or creative thrift. Turning from the crier, you drift toward a spice vendor whose table bursts with dried hibiscus petals and rose hips. You ask the vendor about the red dye used by the priests during certain ceremonies. He nods, mentioning that the pigment came from crushed cochineal beetles shipped from Hispania. That assertion strikes you. Cochineal, the legendary dye that would color robes of emperors centuries later, may have first transited these wooden stalls. Yet it's a point of contention. Some claim the dye here was imported as early as the 4th century BCE. Others argue that climatic differences made Hispania's beetles thrive only later, meaning Helike's pigment was likely a different hue entirely. Your senses reel as you taste a spoonful of dark, syrupy molasses made from boiled grape must mixed with aromatic bark and wildflower honey. You close your eyes, imagining how this mixture would glaze roasted lamb or enrich morning porridge. An approving hum from a nearby olive oil merchant signals he's watched your reaction. He gestures for you to follow him to a small side booth partitioned off by woven mats. Inside, he keeps an assortment of jars labeled in chalk: cinnamon, allspice, juniper berries, and something he calls salt from the moon. Curious, you prod him for details. He grins and produces a thin layer of crystallized salt, white, reflective, almost shimmering. He claims it was harvested during a rare night when the tide receded under a full moon, exposing salt flats beyond the harbor. Scientists are still debating whether tidal phenomena here could ever yield such uniquely pure salt, but you can't argue with its clean, almost sweet flavor. Venturing onward, you notice a cluster of textile merchants displaying dyed wool and linen. Brightly patterned shawls hang like banners. Geometric motifs in indigo and saffron, spirals of red and black, stylized dolphins in looping rows. You feel the fabric's texture, cool and smooth, and ask whether the indigo was sourced locally. The merchant shakes his head. He imports the dye from a village near Ephesus, prized for its deep, enduring blues. Historians are still debating how widespread indigo use was in mainland Greece compared to the more common madder root dyes. A sudden shout draws your attention back to the fish stalls. A young fisherman, chest bare and dripping from a dunk in the shallow harbor, triumphantly hoists aloft a large thornback ray. Its spiny tail arcs menacingly, and he claims its cartilage makes the best glue for ship repairs. You wince, picturing workmen smeared in sticky cartilage residue, but he swears it outlasts pine pitch. You file that under innovative but questionable. Ancient texts mention rays used in medicine and crafts, yet scholars still debate whether bone glue derived from rays was ever truly practical or merely a myth circulated among seafarers craving a boast. Between stalls, you find scribes on low benches inscribing clay tokens, the precursors to coins, with stamps bearing the head of Helike's patron deity and a trident. You examine one stamp token, noting the crispness of the lines despite the token's chipped edge. Mainstream numismatists credit Helike with minting its own currency around 330 BCE to streamline internal trade, but some purists argue the city continued to rely on Corinthian staters far longer, making these tokens more akin to receipts than true coinage. Historians are still debating Helike's monetary autonomy and whether these tokens represent proto-coins or merely clay markers for trade goods. Your exploration leads you to a stall where a venerable elder sells thin clay tablets inscribed with sea shanties and merchants' ballads. He recites a verse in a melodic drone. "O rolling tide, bring ships to bay, fish of silver price to pay. Saffron fields and olives green, trade the threads of distant scene." You hum along, struck by the similarity to verses sung in Mycenae a century earlier. You ask the elder if this song originated in Helike or was borrowed from travelers. He shrugs, half smiling. "Every port steals a song. We just add our flavor." You realize music here is as much currency as coin. A faint braying comes from a nearby pen where goats await transport inland. The handler offers you a taste of fresh goat cheese, aged in brine and wrapped in grape leaves. Its tang is sharp, crumbly, and you can almost hear the bleating of the very goat it came from. You're offered a draught of goat milk yogurt mixed with crushed honeycomb, a sweet tart symphony that leaves your tongue sticky and satisfied. Shadows lengthen as the sun shifts westward, sending long silhouettes across the marketplace. You sense the day entering its final act. A final urgency grips the vendors, those who must sell before the tide creeps in, bringing with it the cool sea breeze. You pause at a spice merchant's table one last time, inhaling sandalwood incense that curls in lazy tendrils above a bowl of crushed frankincense tears. The aroma is resinous, exotic, an olfactory echo of distant caravan routes. You wonder how many tons of frankincense passed through these piazzas over centuries. Obscure note: ancient traders sometimes hid frankincense in sheep's wool to evade taxes. Whether Helike merchants employed that trick remains a point of contention among scholars. You take one last look at the fish stalls, now dimming under the setting sun. Lanterns are lit, clay lamps fueled by olive oil, their wicks trimmed with care. The market square transforms into a gentle glow of golden points, each flame a beacon for late-night bargain hunters or returning sailors. You feel the rhythm shift once more, from the frenetic energy of day to the mellow lull of evening. As you step away from the square, heart and stomach full of spices, fish and stories, you glance back at the mosaic-tiled portico entrance. A final thought crosses your mind. In a few hours, the moon will rise, and the sea breeze will carry away the sense of coriander and salt, leaving only traces on the worn stones. You promise yourself one day you'll return. But for now, the salty marketplace of Helike has etched itself into your memory like a vivid dream. You leave the spice-scented bustle of the market square behind, your steps clicking on smooth flagstones as you follow a gently rising pathway toward the city's spiritual heart. Twilight cloaks the buildings in purples and blues, and lamplight flickers through narrow windows. Ahead, an elegant facade of white marble columns rises against the darkening sky, their fluted shafts catching the last glow of dusk. This is the temple of Artemis Sotyra, the protector of seafarers and refuge of wanderers, though you'll sometimes hear it called simply the Protector's Temple. As you approach, you notice how the temple sits on a raised platform, its stylobate 3 steps high. You pause on the lowest step, feeling the cool marble under your fingertips. Mainstream historians date the original construction of this temple to around 550 BCE, crediting the Corinthian school of architects with its Doric order and precise proportions. Yet others argue that what you see today may incorporate later renovations, possibly as late as the mid-14th century BCE, when the Achaean League funded major rebuilds. Historians are still debating this question. You climb the steps, passing between 2 lion-headed gargoyles carved into the plinth. Each lion's maw forms a small spout where rainwater once ran off the roof, drizzling onto an octagonal draining basin below. Obscure detail. Some local lore claims that on moonlit nights, those dented basins reflect ghostly images of ancient worshippers still offering prayers to Artemis. You smile at the thought, your shadow stretching long across the courtyard. Inside the pronaos, the air is thick with incense and the soft hum of chanting priests. You tread softly so as not to startle the white-robed acolytes arranging fresh garlands of myrtle and laurel. Their voices rise and fall in a lilting melody, and you catch fragments of an ancient hymn. Goddess of wild places, shield our ships from raging waves. The melody seems both timeless and intimate, as if it belongs to every grain of sand on the shore. Beyond the pronaos, you stand in the naos, the inner sanctuary, facing the cult statue of Artemis Sotyra. It's a towering wooden effigy, coated in gold leaf and draped in linen, her left arm raised in blessing while her right holds a quiver of arrows. You can't help but wonder what it must have been like when this statue was first erected, pure brilliance against a backdrop of azure sea. Local priests insist the wood came from a sacred grove dedicated to Artemis on the slopes of Mount Kelmos. But skeptics note there's no surviving record of such a grove ever existing outside legend. At the foot of the statue, the marble floor bears a circular mosaic depicting a sea nymph pouring libations into a conch shell. The tesserae are worn smooth in places, especially along a curved path that suggests worshippers repeatedly traced the same route in their devotions. You kneel, placing your palm on the cool mosaic, and imagine yourself as one of those ancient pilgrims. Mainstream accounts tell us that each dawn, a procession would leave the city gates, carrying fresh vessels of seawater to pour over the statue's base. A ritual meant to renew Artemis's protection over ships departing at sunrise. Near the mosaic's edge, you spot faintly inscribed graffiti, almost hidden. Names, dates, and sometimes small sketches of ships. One reads Antigone of Patras, 428 BCE, alongside a crude drawing of a trireme. Obscure find, archaeologists only recently discovered dozens of these inscriptions, leading some to suggest Helike was a popular pilgrimage site long after its political power waned. Historians are still debating whether these visitors came seeking healing. Local tradition claims the temple's spring water could cure sterility, or simply safe passage. Rising, you step toward a side chamber where bronze oil lamps hang from hooks in the stone wall. Their soot-blackened interiors speak of nightly vigils, each flame representing a sailor's prayer or a traveler's plea for safe return. You lift one lamp carefully, studying its craftsmanship. A shallow dish with a wide lip to prevent oil spills, and tiny decorative handles shaped like dolphins. Obscure fact: similar dolphin motif lamps have been found in underwater wrecks off Lucas, hinting at shared maritime artisans across the Gulf. As you move to the outer ambulatory, the cool breeze carries the faint sound of lapping water. You pause at a low balustrade overlooking the sea, the Gulf curling beyond with a gentle rhythm. The temple's architects oriented this precinct unusually. Instead of facing due east like most Greek temples, this one tilts slightly southeast, directly toward the temple's founding harbor. Some scholars argue this alignment ensured the first rays of dawn sunlight would illuminate the cult statue on equinox mornings. Others say it was a poetic nod to the sea's vital role in Helike's fortunes. Historians are still debating why this deviation from the norm exists. Beneath your feet, the marble slabs bear evidence of chisel marks, rough guidelines that were never fully smoothed, as if work halted abruptly. You run your fingers over these grooves, picturing stonemasons with chisels halting their labor at the command of priests or city officials. One tale suggests an earthquake forced the quarrying to stop mid-project. Another hints at an internal religious dispute over temple finances. No definitive account survives. In a sheltered niche, a small basin carved from single limestone block holds a trickle of water. This spring, fed by subterranean channels, bubbles with perpetual coolness. You dip your fingers in and taste the water. Crisp, sweet, unlike any seawater. Legends say the spring served as the source for the daily libations poured at dawn. Modern geologists note it likely originated from mountain aquifers, filtered through limestone fissures. Obscure debate. Some archaeologists propose the spring was added centuries after initial construction, possibly during Hellenistic renovations, to bolster the temple's reputation for miraculous cures. You continue along the ambulatory, passing a row of half-buried pedestals that once held bronze votive offerings. Faint footprints in the dust trail from one pedestal to another, as if worshippers knelt and then shuffled to the next with ritualistic solemnity. One pedestal retains a shallow indentation, an echo of a chalice or small bowl long since removed. Obscure find. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed at least 12 such pedestals beneath layers of packed earth outside the temple's walls, suggesting a massive pre-tsunami forecourt whose layout remains speculative. As the chanting inside grows softer, you slip back into the central chamber. A priestess glides past, her linen robes trailing behind like ghostly ribbon. She carries a basket of honey cakes shaped like crescent moons. You're invited to taste one soft, sweet, perfumed with thyme and sesame. According to temple lore, these cakes were thrown into the sea during harvest festivals to thank the ocean for its bounty. Obscure note. Occasional shards of honey cake found in coastal sediments suggest fragments may have landed on rocky ledges, leading some to misidentify ancient beehives during early excavations. You notice a small side door partly ajar, revealing a storage room filled with heavy wooden chests bound in bronze bands. You peer inside to see sacks of incense, frankincense, myrrh, and a faintly sweet resin called bdellium. Mainstream records confirm that Helike priests exchanged local olive oil for these exotic substances with Phoenician traders based in Tyre and Sidon. Yet one amber-hued jar stands out, its label inscribed, seafoam dust. A powder so rare it fetched its own premium. Historians are still debating whether seafoam dust was a mythical concoction or a trade name for finely ground shellfish shells used in purification rites. Stepping back into the moonlit courtyard, you catch sight of the temple's shadow on the courtyard stones. Tall columns forming dark silhouettes that stretch across the ground like giant sentinels. Olive trees nearby sway gently, leaves whispering like distant prayers. You find a low stone bench and sit, gazing up at the temple's pediment, where a triangular relief depicts Artemis flanked by lions and waves crashing at their feet. The sculpture is weather-worn, but you can almost trace the outlines of Artemis's bow, poised and ready. You lean back, taking a slow, deep breath of the night air, and think about how many souls must have stood here over the centuries. Fishermen begging for calm seas, merchants seeking profit, young brides praying for fertility. Each left a small part of themselves in the stone and incense smoke. Obscure thought. Some believe minor votive offerings, tiny carved shells and inscribed tokens, are still buried beneath these benches, waiting to be found by future archaeologists. A final hush falls over the courtyard as the last priest exits, closing the great wooden doors behind him with a soft thud. The candlelight inside fades, leaving only moonlight to reveal Artemis's silent form. You rise, brushing dust from your tunic, and take one last look at the temple's serene geometry. The columns loom like watchful guardians, and you feel both dwarfed and cradled by their ancient presence. You descend the marble steps, your heart heavy with awe and curiosity. Behind you, the temple stands steadfast, a beacon of faith in a world of shifting fortunes. You sense that this sanctuary holds not just stone and wood, but memories of storms survived and prayers answered. And as you step away into the quiet streets, the temple's silent blessing follows you. A gentle reminder that even in the darkest nights, light and hope endure. You turn away from the cool marble of Artemis's sanctuary and follow a narrow lane lit by flickering oil lamps, their golden glow dancing off sun-baked walls and puddles still damp from a midday sprinkle. The scent of roasted barley and aged wine drifts toward you, growing richer with each step. Ahead, a painted wooden sign creaks in the breeze, an amphora tilted over a frothing cup. This is the cozy tavern, Helike's most talked about watering hole, where locals and visitors alike gather to swap stories and drown the heat of the day in dark, spiced wine. Pushing open the low door, you're greeted by a burst of warm air heavy with the scent of incense, smoked meats, and something faintly metallic, perhaps the tang of seawater mixed into the evening's vintages. Mainstream accounts tell us that by the late 4th century BCE, taverns in Greek port cities like Helike were well established as centers of commerce and conversation, licensed by local magistrates to serve wine and simple fare. Scholars are still debating how strictly these licenses were enforced. Some argue taverns operated as quasi-official institutions under the city's control, while others insist most were run as family businesses with loose oversight. Historians are still debating this question. Inside, the walls are lined with rough-hewn benches and low tables, each scarred by knife chips and wine stains that tell 1,000 tales. A heavy wooden counter stretches across one side, behind which a broad-shouldered barkeeper with soot-streaked cheeks polishes a gleaming amphora stopper. He looks up, nods at you with a half-smile and sets down his rag. The tavern's lanterns, small clay dishes filled with olive oil, cast a halo of light over the bar, while colored glass panes overhead filter moonlight into pale blues and reds that pool like water on the stone floor. You slide onto a worn bench and settle into its familiar curve. Around you, a dozen patrons lean in close, voices low with excitement or rivalry. To your left, a group of sailors in salt-stiffened tunics toss knucklebones in a circle, wagering cups of wine on each roll. Obscure detail. These knucklebones, polished animal ankle bones, were prized for their irregular shapes, making each throw unpredictable and turning a simple dice game into a test of both luck and skill. Some claim skilled gamblers could palm extra bones to tip the odds, though evidence is purely anecdotal. A server arrives, carrying a tray of clay goblets and a squat pitcher of wine. You watch her balance the load with ease, her braided hair swinging in time with her steps. She sets a goblet before you and pours until a dark pool of liquid forms, almost black in the dim light. You raise the cup to your nose. The aroma is bold, fruity, and just a touch briny. Local lore holds that Helike's vintners sometimes mixed seawater into their wine to give it a sharper edge and extend the barrel's contents, though modern palates might balk at the practice. Scholars continue to debate whether seawater really improved the wine's flavor or if tales of salt-spiked vintages were simply jokes passed among rival producers. You lift the goblet and take a cautious sip. The flavor surprises you, rich with ripe figs and wild herbs, underscored by a faint mineral tang that speaks of the gulf beyond. A burly fisherman at the next table glances over and leans in. "That's a jar we're calling Poseidon's Whisper," he says in a conspiratorial whisper. "Limited run, only barrels from the southern cove. Heard it's blessed by the sea itself." Behind him, laughter bursts out as another patron quips that the real blessing comes from the amount of water you can row past before feeling its effects. Turning your head, you notice a corner where a minstrel strums a lyre carved to resemble intertwined dolphins. He plays a lilting melody, a port song you heard bits of at the fish market, his voice low and smooth. Every so often he pauses for applause or to toss a handful of bronze coins into a wooden bowl perched beside his stool. His fingers move deftly across the strings, coaxing a tune that feels both haunting and homey, like the call of gulls at dawn. You glance around the room, noticing the food that's passed from table to table. Plates of lamb-stewed barley bubble in shallow bowls, steam curling toward the ceiling. You catch a whiff of cumin and coriander, hints of cinnamon, and something faintly sweet, dates stewed until their skins split. Obscure note. Some tavern keepers here reportedly reserve the pit spice dates for travelers who can recite a boastful sea tale, keeping the best morsels for storytellers who entertain the crowd. You're tempted to improvise a tall tale yourself, perhaps about outwitting pirates with a borrowed trireme, but for now you settle for watching others' triumphs and exaggerations. A pair of merchants in fine tunics lean forward, discussing the upcoming festival. One waves a jeweled finger and says, "This year, the priestess plans to scatter saffron petals from the temple roof into the sea for good fortune." The other nods, adding that the saffron will come from a new shipment straight from Crete, rumored to be the most vibrant the island has ever produced. You file that under seasonal extravagance, even as you imagine the petals drifting like red snow on the water's surface. You lean back and tap your fingers on the table, listening to 3 different conversations colliding into a low roar. In one corner, young scribes compare pay rates for writing epitaphs. In another, fishermen brag about who caught the largest octopus this morning. A wandering merchant tells a disdainful story about an inland city where taverns require patrons to leave sandals at the door. As if bare feet weren't enough to show respect, he scoffs. The whole place erupts in laughter, and you catch yourself smiling at the warmth of it all. Behind the bar, the barkeeper slides a wooden tankard of frothy barley beer toward a soldier whose armor still glints faintly under the lantern light. You wave to signal you're ready for more wine, and he pours without a word, just a practiced tilt of the pitcher. Off to your right, a woman in a green cloak sits alone, swirling her wine with practiced grace. She catches your eye and nods, then gestures for you to join her. Something in her expression, a mix of caution and curiosity, prowls at your attention. You stand and weave through tables, each bench a jigsaw of elbows and knees, until you reach her side. "Mind if I join?" you ask. She smiles, lifting her goblet in welcome. "Be my guest," she replies, her voice low and melodic. "I'm Lysandra." You introduce yourself, and as you sip from your cup, she gestures toward a narrow slit in the wall behind her. "See that?" she nods. "An escape hatch, if things ever get rowdy." You glance past her to a small door barely large enough for a single person. Obscure detail. Such secret exits were not uncommon in border town taverns, allowing tavern keepers to avoid fines or angry in-laws when late-night brawls spilled into the street. Whether Helike's version led to the docks or simply to a hidden storeroom is still a matter of debate among local historians. You and Lysandra talk of many things, her travels from Sicyon, yours from afar, favorite vintages, least favorite inns. She laughs at your story of mistaking a temple ritual for a pirate warning, and you marvel at how easily her laughter fills the space. Over time, your glass empties and the tavern's mood shifts. Laughter grows more boisterous, jokes more absurd, songs more drawn out. The smell of singed barley drifts from the hearth as the cook roasts a row of fish on iron spits, seasoning them with rosemary and crushed peppercorns. A commotion rises near the door as 2 sailors stagger in, one supporting the other. The barkeeper slides them stools, murmuring something about friendly fire, the first getting too enthusiastic about the second's tale of sea monsters in the Gulf. You watch as the injured man clutches his arm, not from pain but from dramatic flair, insisting his friend left him for dead in a whirlpool the size of a water wheel. His companion rolls his eyes but pumps his fist in mock solidarity, and soon they're both howling with laughter. You note the stone floor beneath your feet is worn smooth near the hearth, betraying the steps of countless dancers. Soon a fiddler arrives, and a circle opens as patrons rise, grabbing hands or belts and kicking in time. You join the dance, shuffling between tables, your sandals sliding on the polished stones. The music is fast, infectious. For a moment, you lose yourself in the whirl of feet and laughter. But even amid the revelry, there's an undercurrent of seriousness. Between rounds, hushed conversations occur. Talk of shipping routes disrupted by storm clouds gathering offshore. Whispers of political intrigue back in Corinth. Speculation about whether the temple's new festival rituals will appease the gods. You catch a mercenary muttering that his contract binds him to protect a wealthy trader's convoy next month, but he isn't sure the pay will cover the risks of a winter crossing. A fisherman from Illyria complains that recent sea urchin blooms have decimated local shellfish beds. A sign? He swears that Poseidon's patience wears thin. You finish your wine and lean against the bar, noticing the tavern's wooden beams are reinforced with iron. Unusual in a port city so reliant on ships, where iron was both precious and prone to rust. Obscure fact: some believe tavern keepers installed extra iron supports to keep ceilings intact during earthquakes common around the Corinthian Gulf, though archaeological surveys haven't conclusively found similar reinforcements elsewhere. The barkeeper sets down a small plate of olives cured in honeyed wine, insisting it's on the house. You pop one into your mouth. The sweet-salt contrast jolts your senses awake. He leans in and says quietly, "Enjoy it while you can." You raise an eyebrow at the cryptic warning, but he returns to his work, polishing glasses and exchanging quiet jokes with Lysandra. Outside, the wind picks up, rattling the sign above the door. You glance at the window and see storm clouds gathering over the water, dark as spilled ink. A distant crack of thunder rumbles through the night. Patrons pause mid-story to look toward the door, then shrug and return to their cups, with only a flicker of unease breaking their good humor. You thank Lysandra for the company and step back into the alley's cooler air. The tavern's warmth fades behind you, replaced by the hush of wind-swept stone. In your pocket rests a small clay token, a keepsake stamped with the tavern's seal, given to patrons of distinction or those who spun particularly memorable yarns. As you retrieve it and trace the raised amphora image, you realize that tonight's laughter and stories have woven you into Helike's own tapestry of legends. With a final glance at the frosted windowpane, you smooth your tunic and walk on, the tavern's low murmur and occasional laughter echoing in your ears. Beyond its door lies the restless port, the temple's silent sentinel, and a city on the brink of momentous change, where every joke, every dance, every drop of wine might soon be washed away by forces no reveler can outdrink. You slip away from the lantern-lit tavern and follow a narrow cobblestone lane toward the heart of Helike's artisan quarter, where the rhythmic tap-tap of hammer on metal mingles with the gentle whoosh of pottery wheels. An intoxicating blend of kiln smoke, oiled wood shavings, and molten bronze hangs in the air. Nearby, a choir of lathes spins clay vessels, their soft whirring a soothing counterpoint to the clang and hiss of flame. This is the craftsman's workshop district, where you'll witness the deft hands and creative genius that fuel Helike's reputation for fine wares. You approach the first workshop, its open doorway revealing a potter's wheel spinning slowly beside a low charcoal kiln whose top vent puffs tiny clouds of smoke. Inside, a middle-aged woman kneels in a pool of red clay, her fingers coaxing a lump of earth into a graceful amphora. Mainstream historians note that by the 4th century BCE, Greek pottery had evolved from simple geometric designs to intricate, narrative scenes, an art form that reflected both daily life and mythological drama. Indeed, Helike's workshops were famous for their unique wave motif, a swirling border pattern that echoed the Gulf's restless tides. You watch the potter trace that motif around the amphora's shoulder with a bone stylus, her motion fluid and practiced. As the potter lifts the finished vessel from the wheel, you catch a glimpse of small, nearly hidden stamps pressed into its base, tiny seals marking the name of her family workshop. Obscure detail: a handful of these potter's marks discovered centuries later bear cryptic symbols that some believe were shorthand codes for kiln temperatures, while others argue they signaled secret membership in a potter's guild. Historians are still debating what these cryptic marks truly represent. You step into the next workspace, where blacksmith's tongs grip a glowing ingot over a roaring forge. Sparks burst like tiny fireworks as a stout craftsman hammers molten bronze into a gleaming spearhead. Around him, racks hold rows of chisels, nails, and arrowheads, each polished to a mirror finish. You ask about bronze proportions, and he replies without looking up, 3 parts copper, 1 part tin. Anything else is blasphemy. Archaeological finds show that Helike's metalworkers favored slightly higher tin content than neighboring cities, producing bronze that was both harder and more brittle, ideal for weaponry but challenging for sculptors. Some metallurgists suggest this was a deliberate choice to reinforce Helike's reputation as a martial power, while others think it was simply due to local or composition. Historians are still debating whether material preference or political strategy drove that alloy choice. You wander further to a wooden bench cluttered with fine sawdust, where a carpenter shapes a length of walnut into the curved prow of a small boat. His lathe is a marvel of simple mechanics. A foot pedal rotates the wood while his hands guide a sharp blade, carving delicate scrollwork along the hull's edge. He explains that Helike's boats often carried decorative carved dolphins and laurels at the bow, a nod to both Poseidon and Artemis. You run your fingers over the smooth, still warm surface, imagining how those carvings would gleam with sea spray under a midday sun. Nearby, a woman works leather strips into sandals, her awl punching holes with rhythmic precision. She shows you the soles, where she's laced layers of thick goat hide to create waterproof footwear for fishermen. According to local lore, no other city could match Helike's sandals for durability. Some even claimed you could wade across the shallows without feeling a single pebble. Obscure note: there's an offhand reference in an ancient sailor's guide advising mariners to buy Helike sandals in case they needed to trek inland after a shipwreck, though it's unclear if this guide was ever widely circulated. You pause at a table strewn with finely turned wooden bowls, each polished until the grain glows like burnished gold. A young apprentice gestures proudly at a perfectly balanced olive-wood mortar and pestle set, a common kitchen tool valued for its hardness and aromatic scent. He explains that artisans season new mortars by grinding crushed herbs and spices in them, infusing the bowl with protective oils that repel mold and pests. Historians are still debating whether this seasoning practice was born out of empirical kitchen wisdom or ritual purification rites offered to Demeter, goddess of agriculture. On a nearby wall hangs a display of jewelry, thin gold wreaths twisted into olive leaves, silver earrings shaped like tiny dolphins, and necklaces of colored glass beads that gleam like gemstones. You pick up a delicate diadem, its filigree leaves so fine they almost tremble in your hand. A jeweler calls it the wave-kissed filigree, boasting that it captures the motion of breaking surf. He tells you that local glassmakers discovered a formula to manufacture cobalt blue beads by mixing metal oxides in heated sand, an innovation that spread across the Aegean. Some scholars credit Helike's jeweler guild with this breakthrough, while others attribute it to Phoenician traders who passed through the port. Historians are still debating the true origin of that striking blue glass. Toward the back of the district, you find a small courtyard where a pair of toolmakers sharpen copper saws, bronze chisels, and iron gouges. You watch sparks fly as they hone a blade on a spinning grindstone powered by a treadle. One craftsman hands you a small bronze spike, thinner than your pinky, which he claims is ideal for blockchain-like weaving in fine textiles. You examine the spike's tip. It's honed to a microscopic point that would glide through cloth fibers without tearing. Obscure detail: surviving examples of these weaving spikes have been found in burial sites of wealthy women, suggesting they were treasured possessions or even status symbols. A sudden roar drifts in from the street, sounds of a donkey caravan groaning under the weight of marble blocks bound for the temple. You peek through the open gateway and see rough-cut stones tied with rope, destined to become pedestals, altars, or even pavement slabs. Local masons were known for their skill at carving fine moldings directly into the stone before it left the quarry, saving labor on site. Some 21st-century archaeologists argue this pre-carving accounts for the uniformity of Helike's Doric columns, while others insist it simply reflects efficient workshop organization. Historians are still debating whether this technique was an innovation unique to Helike or part of a wider Corinthian tradition. Back in the main hall of the crafts district, you find a pottery merchant arranging fresh amphorae for sale. He tells you that these vessels aren't just utilitarian. They're works of art meant for display in wealthy households across Greece. He offers you a slender jug with a twisted handle and invites you to inspect the painted scene. A heron stalking fish at the water's edge. The paint is matte black against the pale clay, the details so crisp it looks almost photographic. He explains that the pigment comes from finely ground, purified clay fired under low oxygen conditions, a process passed down through secret family recipes. Obscure note: a few amphorae bearing this heron motif were later misattributed to Corinth itself, leading to centuries of confusion in classical collections. Historians are still debating which workshops in Helike produced those signature scenes. You wander toward a side chamber where a master sculptor chisels a block of limestone into a graceful dolphin leaping above stylized waves. His hammer strikes with steady rhythm, and stone dust hangs in the air like golden snow. He pauses to measure proportions with a wooden caliper, ensuring the curvature of each fin matches his mental blueprint. Mainstream sources tell us that Helike sculptors borrowed heavily from Corinthian and Argive styles, but infused local motifs, waves, shells, fish, into their reliefs and statuary. This blend created a distinctive regional flavor that art historians still recognize today. As you watch the sculptor's hands, you notice tiny marks at the base of the block, dots and dashes that look like a primitive tally. He explains these are workshop inventories. Each dot represents a day's work, each dash an apprentice's contribution. Obscure detail. Some believe these tally marks doubled as signatures so that when statues were gifted to distant sanctuaries, the recipient could trace the work back to the original workshop. Historians are still debating whether these marks served practical bookkeeping purposes or carried symbolic meaning tied to craftsmanship pride. You move to a corner where glassblowers gather around a small furnace, their bellows driven by a small hand-cranked wheel. They shape molten blobs of translucent green and amber glass into elegant drinking cups and perfume bottles no larger than a fingertip. One glassblower hands you a miniature alabastron, a tiny bottle once used to hold precious oils. You uncork it and inhale a lingering scent of rose and myrrh. He tells you that these perfume vessels were so prized that wealthy women sometimes wore them on their person, dangling from belts or woven into hair braids. Beyond the glassblowers, you spot a quiet alcove where a master mapmaker lays out long sheets of papyrus, ink pots at the ready. He draws a detailed chart of the Gulf's coastline, marking depths, currents, and hidden shoals. You lean over to study his lines, each curve precise, each annotation neat. He explains that Helike's captains contributed their first-hand navigational notes in exchange for free passage through local harbors. Obscure insight. Some scholars think these collaborative charts formed the basis for later classical-era maritime maps, though no original papyrus survives. Historians are still debating the extent of Helike's influence on ancient cartography. You step outside into a narrow courtyard ringed by low workshops, the setting sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. The potter's kiln glows one last time, the blacksmith's forge hisses as it cools, and the woodcarver lays aside his tools, wiping sweat from his brow. You realize that this district hums with life every dawn to dusk, each artisan dedicating hours of skilled labor to create the objects that shape daily reality, spiritual practice, and even the legends of Helike. As you prepare to leave, one of the apprentices offers you a small clay token stamped with a potter's wheel and a dolphin motif, a keepsake to remember your visit. You slide the token into your pocket, feeling its weight against your palm. The crafts district falls silent at evening's approach, but the echoes of hammer blows, spinning wheels, and whispered debates about kiln temperatures linger in your mind. You step back onto the cobblestone street, carrying with you not just vessels and tools, but the artistry and ingenuity that made Helike a center of creativity on the Corinthian shore. You slip away from the din of the artisan quarter and make your way down a winding path that hugs the shoreline, where limestone cliffs rise like silent sentinels above you. The moonlight shimmers on the black water, and a cool breeze carries the whisper of waves against the rocks. Ahead, hidden by tangled vines and driftwood, you spot a narrow opening in the cliff face, a dark slit barely large enough for one person to squeeze through. This is the secret cavern, a place few in Helike know about, and those who do guard its location jealously. Crouching low, you push aside a curtain of seaweed that clings damp and cool to your arms, and you duck into the narrow entrance. Instantly, the world outside disappears into a vault of shadow and sound. The cavern's floor is slick with a thin film of seawater that laps at your ankles, carrying with it the briny scent of the deep. You light a small oil lamp. Its flickering flame casts long, wavering shadows on jagged walls glinting with mineral deposits. Mainstream explorers first documented this grotto in the 19th century when workers quarrying limestone for the temple's renovations accidentally broke through a wall, revealing a hidden chamber filled with seashells and carved niches. Locals, however, claim the cave has been known, and secretly used, since Helike's earliest days, perhaps as a clandestine worship site for sailors who dared not make offerings in the open. As you venture deeper, the ceiling arches overhead, dripping clear droplets that plink into shallow pools below. The light from your lamp reveals barnacles and encrusted mussels clinging to every crevice along the lower walls. Proof that the sea claims this chamber at high tide. You step carefully, your sandals sliding on slick stone, and you notice the faint outline of a carved dolphin near one pool's edge. Obscure detail. Some archaeologists suggest this carving predates the classical temple, hinting at a pre-Hellenic cult of sea spirits in the region. Historians are still debating whether these carvings are early additions to Artemis worship or remnants of an even older belief system. The path twists and slopes downward, and soon you come upon the grotto's heart, a natural basin where seawater pools in crystalline stillness. In the basin's center, a cluster of weathered amphorae stands half-submerged, their necks broken off and their surfaces smooth from centuries of waves. You pluck one from the cluster and peer inside. Sand and tiny pebbles swirl in the dim light. According to local legend, these amphorae hold the remnants of ritual offerings: olive oil, wine, and once, it's said, a child's silver bracelet cast in hope of safe passage for a lost sailor. Whether any offerings remain is impossible to confirm, but you can't deny the hush of reverence that fills the chamber. Behind the basin, carved into the stone wall, is a small ledge covered in striations, scratches that look like tally marks. You count 18 deep grooves, each worn smooth at the edges. Obscure note. Some speculate these marks recorded the number of sailors who made vows here before departure, while others argue they were just the result of fishermen sharpening tools in the gloom. Historians are still debating the true purpose of these enigmatic scratches. You crouch beside the basin and dunk your fingers into the salt-cold water, watching concentric ripples spread across the surface. The lamp's flame trembles in the breeze that drifts in from the sea, and for a moment, you imagine that the water itself is alive, an echo of Poseidon's mood rising and falling with each lunar cycle. It's easy to see why sailors might slip here under the cover of night, leaving silent prayers and secret tokens when no one else could see. Turning from the pool, you follow a narrow ledge that curves along the inner wall of the cavern. The lantern light picks out tiny fossils embedded in the limestone, spiral ammonites and jagged fragments of crinoid stems. You pause to brush away a patch of silt, revealing the fossil's intricate curls. Obscure detail. Some naturalists believe that ancient mariners collected these marine fossils and presented them at Artemis's temple as gifts from the sea's depths, interpreting them as proof of divine blessings. Historians are still debating whether Helike's worshippers valued these fossils ritually or simply admired them as curiosities. As the passage tightens, you duck under a low arch where the rock ceiling dips to your shoulders. The sound of dripping water echoes like a slow drumbeat. You feel the air grow cooler and more humid. A scent of clammy stone mixes with a faint hint of something floral, perhaps wild fennel or thyme growing in a crack high above, beyond your view. With each step, the light from your lamp reflects off tiny crystals scattered across the walls, making the cave shimmer like a star-studded sky. Eventually, you emerge into a wider chamber where the ceiling opens to the night sky through a jagged fissure. Moonlight pours in, illuminating a natural altar, a flat slab of rock polished smooth by centuries of use. On the altar's surface, you spot faint stains of dried resin and oil, and beside them, a carved indentation shaped like a shallow bowl. Obscure find. Some say this bowl held small offerings of myrtle or barley cakes, while others maintain it was used to mix sacred seawater with honey for libations. Historians are still debating whether these layers date back to Helike's classical heyday, or are later additions by Byzantine hermits who claimed the cave as a hermitage. You crawl onto the altar and sit cross-legged, letting the moonlight wash over you. From this vantage point, you see the sea's black expanse beyond the cavern mouth, waves flickering silver under the moon. The hush here is profound, a silence so deep it feels like an embrace. You close your eyes, and for a moment, it's as if time pauses. The hush becomes a presence, and you can almost hear the heartbeat of the gulf itself. Faint music drifts in from outside, perhaps from a distant festival or a lone musician practicing on the quay. Its melody is carried on the breeze, weaving through the cavern's arches like a ghostly hymn. You open your eyes to watch moths flutter around the opening above, drawn to the lamp's glow and the moon's pull. One lands on the carved dolphin, and you imagine it as a messenger from the gods, delivering your prayers back to the hidden depths. After a while, you stand and explore the chamber's edges. In a shadowed corner, hidden behind a curtain of stalactites, you find an odd, man-made niche carved into the rock. Inside sits a small, moss-covered amphora with a cork sealed by hardened wax. Your heart quickens. Could this be a modern prank or the last true relic of ancient rites? You lift it gingerly and brush away the moss. The wax seals perfectly. You hesitate, then pry it open with a careful twist. Inside is a handful of tiny white pebbles, each the size of a lentil. Obscure surprise. Some say these pebbles were believed to be tears of nereids, collected to grant safe passage, while skeptics claim they're simple beach stones left by souvenir hunters. Historians are still debating whether such pebbles were ever part of genuine ancient practice or a more modern invention. You leave the pebbles where they belong and replace the cork, sliding the amphora back into its niche. As you turn to leave, you pause at the entrance and look back at the shimmering pool, the fossil-strewn walls, and the moonlit altar. In the hush, you can almost swear the cave exhales, a gentle sigh of sea and stone, witness to centuries of hidden devotion. Crawling back through the narrow passage, you emerge once more into the open night. The vine-draped mouth of the cavern frames the stars above, and you step out onto the salt-kissed rocks. You slip away from the echoing lull of the secret cavern and wander back toward Helike's shoreline, your boots crunching on stray pebbles and driftwood. The moon hangs low over the gulf, its silver light shimmering on gentle waves. You pause at the water's edge, letting the quiet wrap around you. A faint breeze carries the scent of salt and wild thyme, mingling with the distant murmur of late-night revelers back in the city. Everything feels tranquil, almost too tranquil. Suddenly, the ground beneath your feet trembles. You catch your balance, startled, as the pebbles shift and roll against one another. It's subtle at first, a low vibration like a humming drum, but it intensifies with a deep, rhythmic pulse. You grip a nearby boulder to steady yourself, heart thudding. Mainstream accounts record that Helike's fate was sealed by a powerful earthquake in 373 BCE, estimated at a magnitude of around 6.5 to 7.0 on modern scales, enough to shatter buildings and send tremors rippling across the Corinthian Gulf. Tonight, you feel a whisper of that same force, an ancient warning carried through time. You lift your gaze to the dark water. The waves, moments ago gentle, start to roll more insistently, as if nudged by an unseen hand. In the city behind you, a lamp flickers and goes out. You blink, and another across the quay winks off in response, one by one plunging entire blocks into soft darkness. You realize that the earthquake must be shaking more than just the ground underfoot. It's unsettling the foundations of lampstands and lantern hooks, turning steady light into dancing shadows. Your pulse quickens. You imagine the great limestone blocks of Helike's temple, columns that once stood pristine and white, quivering at their bases, dust sifting down into the spirit of Artemis's inner sanctum. According to temple records, the quake struck at dusk, when worshippers were just returning from evening rites, leaving the sanctuary crowded with priests murmuring final prayers. You wonder what prayers they whispered as the ground buckled beneath their sandals. A low rumble builds, like a giant exhaling deep in the earth's crust. The sound merges with the pounding in your chest. You step back from the water, edging onto firmer ground. You can't help but notice the distant trill of terrified animals. A dog's panicked bark, an owl's frantic hoots, even crickets gone silent as though the night itself is holding its breath. Obscure detail. Some ancient writers claimed that before the Great Quake, flocks of cicadas fell silent and schools of fish beached themselves on the shallows, testament to animals' uncanny sense of shifting tectonic plates, though modern scholars still debate whether such behavior is reliable earthquake forewarning. The tremors arrive in waves, each stronger than the last. You press your back against a broken column lying half-buried in sands, seeking its support. Splintered shards of pottery skitter across the stones at your feet. A distant tower bell tolls unexpectedly, its iron tongue struck by convulsing masonry. Your eardrums ring as another quake wave pulses through you, and the world feels wrenched off its axis. Instinct kicks in. You spin on your heel and race toward the city gate, every footfall urgent. You navigate narrow alleys slick with loosened gravel, guided only by the moon's pale arc. You emerge into the main street, once thrumming with merchants and stable boys, now empty save for the rolling dust clouds kicked up by collapsing rooftops. You pause at the edge of the marketplace, watching stone arches and porticos snap like twigs, sending showers of brick and mortar clattering to the ground. A blast of air hits your face, a gust funneled through a crumbling doorway. You stagger as the ground buckles under you, nearly sending you sprawling. You catch yourself on a merchant's cart overturned nearby, its wheels spinning uselessly. The cart's clay jars, once brimming with saffron and salted fish, crack open, spilling spices and brine into the street. The scent is both familiar and eerie, the perfume of saffron mixed with the bite of seawater, as though Helike itself is bleeding her treasures onto the stones. You hear a great groan to your left and spin just in time to see the facade of a stone house peel outward, walls bulging then collapsing in a slow-motion cascade. You sprint past, heart hammering, and duck into the safety of a narrow doorway. You press your palm against the cool stone and grit your teeth as another quake tremor rattles every loose tile overhead. Through the door's crack, you glimpse a woman clutching a lamp in her arms, her face pale as she prays softly to Artemis for deliverance. Memories flash of what you've seen here. The temple's grand columns, the tavern's laughter, the craftsman's fires. Now all lie vulnerable, held hostage by forces you can neither see nor reason with. Mainstream geologists studying Helike's destruction point to the Kefalonia fault system, an active strike-slip fault beneath the Gulf, as the quake's likely source. Yet some propose an alternative, that the collapse of a subsurface salt dome triggered a sudden land subsidence, causing the ground to drop and create an almost vertical seawall that funneled water inland. Historians are still debating which geological mechanism truly doomed Helike, and you realize that even in hindsight, the city's fate remains enigmatic. You push from the doorway and dash down the street toward the water again, breath ragged. You're driven by a single thought. Get to the quay, warn anyone who remains. You burst onto the dock, where half-broken boats bob against splintered piers. The water here churns unnaturally, swirling in tight eddies and voids that never existed before. Waves that were once a gentle lap now hammer against hulls with bone-jarring force. A fisherman yells, "Out to sea! Out to sea!" He's dragging a small skiff toward the deeper channel, pulling on an oar with every ounce of strength. You run alongside him, grabbing the oar's handle. He turns, eyes wide, and shouts, "We need to get beyond the breakwater, before the sea rises." You climb aboard the skiff as the earthquake's roar finally dies down to an ominous tremor. Your limbs tremble, not from fear alone but from exhaustion and the aftershocks that ripple through the hull. The fisherman pushes off and rows hard, you joining in his thrusts, muscles burning. The shore behind you fractures in silent horror. Wooden piers collapse, houses plunge into sand, and pillars of dust and debris rise where monuments once stood. As you reach the outer breakwater, the sea is eerily calm, like a held breath. You look back, half expecting to see Helike intact, but instead you glimpse a yawning rupture in the beach where the city's grand entrance once lay. Obscure observation. Some survivors later described finding deep fissures running beneath the central plaza, as if the earth had swallowed whole streets. A detail that doesn't appear in many official reports, leaving scholars to question whether some accounts exaggerated for dramatic effect. You pull the oars free and let the current carry you, chest heaving, as you stare north toward the silent shore. Beneath the moon's glow, shapes shift in and out of darkness. The shoreline bowed inward, rooftops half-submerged, temple steps evacuated from their foundations. A hush descends, broken only by gentle water sounds and the sizzle of candles being extinguished on distant docks. You close your eyes, letting the cool wind bathe your face. Your mind reels between relief at being alive and sorrow for the city you left behind. Helike, shining pearl of the Gulf, has crumbled in a matter of heartbeats. You think of the priests who clung to their prayers, the potters whose kills lay silent, the tavern keepers whose laughter died in mid-story. All gone, or at least buried under mud and brine. The fisherman nudges you. We'll have to wait till dawn, he says. Then we see what remains. His voice is steady, but you hear the skiff drifts in the strange calm beyond the breakwater, your muscles still trembling from the frantic rowing. The fisherman beside you sits hunched over the oars, his head bowed in exhaustion and dread. You stare toward the shoreline, where Helike's silhouette has become a jagged mosaic of broken walls and submerged rooftops. The moon reflects off the water's glassy surface, but beneath that deceptive tranquility, something more dreadful stirs. Without warning, the sea begins to pull back. Slowly at first, a subtle retreat, as if the water itself is gulping for breath. You rub your eyes, sure that fatigue is playing tricks on you, but the fisherman's face goes white as he grips the sides of the skiff. It's coming, he whispers, voice hollow, like the sea is exposing its belly. Mainstream accounts of the disaster note that witnesses described the retreat of the Gulf's waters as the first ominous sign of the tsunami, a terrifying spectacle that drew people onto the newly exposed seabed. You scoot to the bow, peering over the edge as the shoreline recedes dozens of yards, revealing mussel beds and coral-encrusted rocks normally hidden under the waves. Barnacles cling to outcroppings, and you see strange anemone scars on flat stones. Obscure detail. Some survivors claimed they could see long-dormant shipwrecks lying in eerie formation on the sea floor, rusted anchors and wooden ribs protruding like the spines of long-forgotten leviathans. Historians are still debating whether those shipwreck sightings were real or the product of collective panic and overactive imaginations. A low rumble vibrates through the hull as the water continues to recede, sloshing against the skiff's keel. You glance back at the fisherman, whose knuckles have gone bone-white around the worn wood. We need to move, you say, voice tight, farther out. He nods without taking his eyes off the vanishing pier, and together you stand, clambering awkwardly in the small boat. You push with all your might, urging the skiff toward deeper water. The oars cut through the still water with hollow plunks, each stroke carrying you farther from the exposed seabed. The sky above remains eerily silent. Even the wind has died, leaving the only soundtrack the rhythmic scraping of oarlocks and your own pounding heartbeat. Then you see it, a towering wall of water rising on the horizon, illuminated in ghostly silver by the moon. It crests far beyond the pilings of the broken dock, an impossible mountain surging toward you. You stumble back, heart in your throat, as the fisherman war cries a warning and lifts his oar like a spear. You've heard that this tsunami crest stood over 12 meters high, enough to engulf the harbor walls and smash great triremes like splintered driftwood. Now, in the cold lunar light, you understand the horror. The wave's face is smooth and glassy, arcing higher than the collapsed temple columns you can still make out inland. Its roar is distant at first but builds with every heartbeat, a terrible growl that shakes the boat and makes your teeth rattle. Hold on, you scream, though the sound is swallowed by the approaching tempest. You clutch the gunwales, trying to anchor yourself as the skiff rocks violently. The fisherman cocks his head back, letting out a guttural cry, and then together you drop to the bottom of the boat, bracing against the trough. The wave hits like a freight train. Water slams into the skiff's side with bone-crushing force, lifting it until the hull seems to hang in midair, then flinging it downward into a churning cauldron of foam. You taste salt and brine, feel your lungs seize as the boat upends. For a moment, you're submerged, weightless in a swirl of debris. Splintered planks, tangled ropes, fragments of amphorae carrying crushed olives and dried wine. Your world flips end over end, a violent kaleidoscope of sky, sea, and twisted wood. You claw at the surface, finally breaking free, gasping for air. A swirl of white water pulls at you like an undertow, dragging you down before spitting you back out. You catch a glimpse of the fisherman, his face a mask of desperate focus, arms thrashing as he tries to keep afloat. You kick and stroke, fighting the water's crushing grip, until you feel your hand brush against a floating hatch cover. You grab it, hauling yourself atop the splintered wood. The surge tosses you high, then drops you into a calmer pocket behind a fractured breakwater. You cling to the debris, chest heaving, water streaming from your hair and tunic. Above you, the wave towers still, a shuddering wall unraveling as it loses height past the shore. You watch it surge inland, swallowing everything in its path. Buildings collapse like sandcastles, fishermen's huts are flattened, and pillars snap off at their bases like stumps. The sea carries the city's treasures, vessels, nets, oil jars, floating them past masonry and marble alike. You can see figures swept from the docks, clinging to floated wreckage or struggling in the spray like drowned insects. Obscure note: some accounts claim that survivors saw the white marble of Artemis's statue bobbing in the surf, its gilded limbs gleaming then slipping beneath the waves forever. Whether the statue was destroyed or recovered centuries later is still uncertain. No archaeological record confirms its fate. You shudder at the thought of that serene face, gilded and timeless, lost to the fury of the Gulf. Your mind flashes back to the temple's colonnade, the harbor's marketplace, the workshop district's glinting forges, all erased in a single apocalyptic moment. You press your feet against the hatch cover to hold on, scanning the swirling debris for the fisherman. He bursts through the foam, goggles of hair plastered to his face, and you shout his name. He sees you and paddles toward you, each stroke a battle against exhaustion and shock. "Grab on!" you yell, motioning to a broken or shaft jutting from the water. He reaches it, his arms trembling as he hauls himself close. Together you cling to the splintered wood, shivering as the water's flat surface quakes with residual waves. The roar has receded to a distant thunder, replaced by the plinking of smaller waves and cries echoing from the battered shore. You glance inland, where the receding wave has left ruin in its wake. Steam rises from shattered cookfires, and clay jars crackle in the sunken marketplace. Lanterns float upside down in shallow pools. Farther off, you make out a patchwork of salvaged boats drifting aimlessly in the harbor's new contours. The moon slides behind a cloud, plunging everything into a deeper darkness, and you feel the full weight of the devastation. The fisherman exhales, a raspy sound, and slumps against the hatch. "By the gods!" he rasps. "Helike is gone." You nod, voice lost in the roar of your own pulse. The sea is calm once more, but its surface reflects only ruin. A faint light flickers from a distant vessel still afloat, the silhouette of a rescue boat, perhaps cast off by sailors who escaped earlier. You raise an arm, signaling, and the light veers toward you. Relief blooms in your chest even as sorrow grips your heart. On board, they pull you and the fisherman up, blankets draped around your shoulders. You lean against the hull's rail, water dripping from your chin, eyes fixed on the shattered city as it vanishes into the dawn's gray horizon. Somewhere in that tangle of fallen walls and abandoned amphory lies Helike's heartbeat. Silenced for you return to Helike's shoreline the morning after the deluge, stepping from the rescue vessel into thigh-deep water that still laps at broken cobblestones. The world feels alien. Sunlight glints off fragments of marble and wood drifting among reeds, and the air smells of brine and overturned earth. You push your trousers up and wade forward, each step revealing another piece of a city half-sunken in mud and memory. All around you, shallow pools cover cracked streets once bustling with merchants. A lone column lies on its side, its fluted surface scarred by the surge, and you pause to trace the groove where water carved its power. Scholars note that after the tsunami, Helike's ruins lay submerged and buried under silt for nearly 2 millennia until modern explorers first recognized the outlines of its streets in the 1800s. You can imagine the thrill those first investigators felt when pottery shards and column drums emerged from the cold water like buried treasures. You stoop to examine a broken amphora neck jutting from the mud. Its glaze still bears faint traces of a black figure dance scene. Figures locked in battle, horses rearing. A lesser-known fact: some pottery fragments here show hints of a vermilion pigment that seems out of place, suggesting Helike's artisans experimented with rare dyes imported from distant lands. Historians are still debating whether that pigment was used for sacred ceremonies or simply to impress wealthy patrons. With each footfall, your boots disturb layers of red clay and silt, sending sediment clouds swirling. Torn wooden beams float by, barnacle-encrusted and heavy, the remains of roof supports and door frames rendered eerily graceful in the gentle current. You glance northwest and recognize the edge of the agora, where a raised platform once hosted public speeches. Today, only a tier of sunken stones marks its presence. You swim over to one of those stones and run a hand along its moss-slick side. In places, ancient inscriptions peek through the algae, names of city magistrates and short decrees carved centuries ago. Among these, a cryptic reference to a feast of Amphitrite hints at a local sea goddess ritual unknown elsewhere, leading some scholars to wonder if fishermen's families held secret ceremonies alongside official worship. You surface and take a breath, feeling the sun's warmth on your face. A buoy-topped marker floats nearby, left by modern archaeologists to designate a trench where they've mapped structural remains. You swim toward it, noting rows of square foundation stones, building blocks of what was likely a house or small workshop. You peer down into the trench, where stratified layers of mud and collapsed masonry tell a silent story of sudden destruction followed by centuries of quiet burial. Exiting the water, you find a narrow causeway, once a bridge over a shallow canal, that now stands half-submerged. You climb onto its sunken surface and crouch to examine a carved limestone relief still visible above the surface. A stylized dolphin within a circle. You recall seeing that same motif on temple bas-reliefs, a repeated symbol of Helike's maritime identity. Even underwater, its carved lines remain remarkably crisp. Further along, you come upon what was once the entrance to the Temple of Artemis. The water here is waist-high, so you wade carefully, feeling small stones and fallen tiles beneath your fingers. You look up to the fallen columns, now half-swamped, and imagine the grandeur of the temple's pediment, once crowned with sculpted lions and curling waves. Rumor has it that divers once reported finding fragments of a gilded bronze amphora statue among the debris, though none of those fragments have ever surfaced, leaving its existence shrouded in mystery. Your boots splash into a deeper basin where you recognize the market's central fountain. Its lion-head spouts lie silent and pitted with barnacles. The bowl below now teems with fish, tiny mullet darting amid bits of ancient mortar. It's eerie to realize that this corner of the agora, once the hub of civic chatter, has been claimed by creatures that treat its stones like underwater cliffs. You clamber out again onto a submerged threshold, noticing an indentation worn by centuries of sandals, possibly the very spot where you once sampled those famous chickpeas. There's a hollow beneath your boot where mud has scoured out the groove, as if the city's first footsteps left an imprint that plays back again and again beneath the waves. Moving north, you enter what modern charts label the residential quarter. Here, the water is clear enough to reveal mosaic floors, once hidden under rubble, now shimmering with sunlight refracted through the surface. You dive down to touch one, white and blue tesserae arranged in a geometric star, its core intact despite the shifting mud. These mosaics are among the earliest floor decorations in Greece, predating more famous Hellenistic examples by decades. You trace the pattern with reverence, marveling at domestic artisans whose personal homes became canvases for early aesthetic innovation. Dry fragments of painted plaster cling to a half-sunken wall, streaked with faded ochre and charcoal images, a wreathed figure holding a trident. You imagine these frescoes greeting visitors with allegories of sea and land entwined. Recent pigment analyses even suggest traces of Egyptian lapis mixed into the blue, hinting at trade contacts or pilgrim donations reaching from distant temples. Historians still debate whether that lapis was a deliberate artistic choice or simply the result of reused materials. You stand in the shallow courtyard of what must have been a grand house, its peristyle columns toppled but arranged in a rough circle by underwater currents. In the center lies a collapsed altar, cracked yet recognizable as the platform where families offered morning libations to Hestia and Demeter. Now, the hearth is silent, its ashes lost beneath centuries of silt. As you explore the winding lanes, you stumble across a scatter of small clay tokens, discs stamped with a trident, likely used by harbor officials to track goods. Some experts argue these tokens functioned alongside official coinage as tally markers for dock duties, a practice unique to smaller ports like Helike. Others insist they were no more than gaming pieces repurposed by custom officials, highlighting how everyday objects could shift roles in times of crisis. You wade toward a cluster of stone steps leading into the Fisherman's Guild Hall. The doorway gapes, and you peer inside to see benches carved from single blocks of stone, still aligned in neat rows. On the floor, seaweed weaves between mosaic fragments, one panel depicting a school of fish swirling in a spiral. You kneel on the top step, sensing the weight of generations who gathered here to share catch reports and settle disputes. Now, their debates lie quiet beneath water and weed. Emerging back into open water, you head for the quay's far edge, where the largest sunken shipwreck lies embedded in mud. You secure a small lantern to your belt and wade into deeper water. The wreck's ribs jut skyward like the bones of a great beast, and you swim around its bow, spotting broken amphorae still held in cargo racks. Contents long spilled but shells intact. Remarkably, some of those amphorae bear stamps from workshops on a small island near Crete, indicating Helike's trade network extended farther south than once believed. Scholars debate just how those imports navigated the currents to reach the Corinthian Gulf. You surface beside the wreck and notice a rope descending into its hold. You tighten your grip on the lantern's handle and lower yourself into the murky gloom. Inside, silt hangs like eerie fog, and the beam of your lamp uncovers shards of pottery, iron nails, and a corroded stylus once used to write on wax tablets. You imagine the clerk who lost it, perhaps transcribing orders for a merchant voyage. A glint of bronze catches your eye among the wreckage. You brush away silt to reveal a small statuette, Artemis standing on a wave, bow in hand, her features worn smooth. Divers argue whether this figurine was part of the ship's cargo, intended for a shrine, or belonged to someone on board as a personal talisman. Historians still debate its provenance and purpose. You surface and kick back toward shallower water. The sun has climbed higher now, scattering diamonds across the bay. You wade ashore, water dripping from hair and tunic, and look back at the ruins shimmering beneath the surface. Each broken column and scattered tile speaks of Helike's fleeting brilliance, a city built on commerce, faith, and craftsmanship, now lying silent beneath the waves. You gather a few small tokens, a shard of distinct pottery here, a stamped disc there, and slip them into your pack for later study. As you trudge toward firmer ground, boots squelching in mud, you carry more than artifacts. You carry stories of a sunken city waiting to be heard. Beneath the rubble and brine, Helike's spirit endures, whispering through the water that once claimed it and urging future generations to listen and remember. You drift away from the half-sunken docks and wade onto a stretch of shoreline strewn with debris. Splintered hull planks, shards of amphorae, twisted metal nails. The sea here has receded once more, leaving behind a mosaic of wreckage and tangled nets. Fishermen whose vessels survived, or whom sheer luck spared, stand in small clusters, their faces lined with salt and sorrow. They're eager to share what they remember, and tonight, you're here to listen. You sink onto a smooth boulder, the moonlight still generous in the early evening sky, and let the fishermen settle around you. One by one, they offer you cups of watered wine, brimming with the sharp tang of seawater and the warmth of Greek grapes. The first to speak is Thesleon, a weathered man whose hands look like ancient driftwood. He settles his broad frame against a rock and begins in a dialect so thick it feels like you're tasting it. Before the quake, the sea was our mother, he says, voice low. We knew her rhythms when she rested, when she stirred. But that night, she turned on us. You lean in, trying to catch every syllable. Mainstream historians agree that in coastal Greek cities, fishermen relied on decades of oral tradition to predict sea behavior, from lunar cycles to seasonal currents. Here in Helike, local lore said the Gulf's tides obeyed Artemis's whims, but practical men like Thesleon learned their lessons from observation, not prayer. He takes a long pull of wine, then continues. My nets hung heavy with squid that evening. I was hauling them in, humming a tune my mother taught me, the song of the silver shoal. But the sea went quiet. Not a fish jumped, not a wave lapped. Even the gulls hushed their cries. An elderly fisherman named Damocles nods, adding in a huskier accent. And the air smelled of rain, but it never came. Instead, the earth groaned first. We felt the stones of the quay twist under our feet. He rubs his cheek, as if brushing away a phantom tremor. I thought it was just an aftershock. Then I saw the water drain away. You know that retreating water is a hallmark of tsunamis, but hearing it described in this thick, rolling dialect makes it visceral. Like the sea gulping air before a scream. One fisherman told you earlier. Obscure detail. Survivors sometimes reported glimpsing entire schools of fish stranded on exposed rocks, their flapping bodies silenced under the moon's glare. An eerie tableau photographers in later centuries would struggle to verify. Next to speak is young Corionos, barely more than a boy but already scarred by sea and loss. He tilts his head, nodding his fingers around the wooden hilt of a broken oar. We tried to save what we could, he whispers, voice tight. Someone shouted, into the deep water, but half the boats wouldn't budge. Chains had rusted into the stone anchors. They were dragged from their moorings, smashed against the piers. He gestures to a distant wreck, its keel half submerged. There she lies, the dolphin's crest, my father's pride. He named her for Artemis, said her hull would sing to the goddess herself. He chuckles, a broken sound. I thought that was nonsense. Now she sings no more. You press your lips together, letting the silence fill the danger-lit space between each confession. Mainstream archaeological surveys confirm that many of Helike's fishing vessels lay shattered within the harbor, their hulls so embedded in silt they became part of the seabed for centuries. Yet these men talk as though the boats were living beings, each with its own personality and fate. A third fisherman, Clitomachos, pipes up from further back. He speaks the purest form of the local patois, words sliding out like polished pebbles. We saw lights, he says, voice low and reverent. On the water, drifting lanterns, even after we thought every lamp had snuffed. I swear one passed within arm's reach of my bow. No one was on it. The flame danced as if it were fueled by grief. You let your eyes narrow, studying his face. A mainstream explanation might chalk this up to drifting lanterns caught in currents or hallucinations born of shock and sleepless nights. But you can't help but wonder if there's something more. Some lingering spark of souls unwilling to leave their city behind. Damocles snorts, but not derisively. Grief or no, that light guided us, he admits. I followed it to deeper water. I thought it was a sign from Poseidon, maybe the god's pity, or Artemis's hand showing us mercy. Obscure belief. Coastal communities often interpreted natural phenomena as divine messages, and Helike's fishermen believed that observant gods could grant second chances. Yet scholars still debate whether such interpretations were widespread or if they're romanticized retellings that crept into the record centuries later. Thessalion shifts, raising his wine cup. We spoke of the city's end with quiet voices. No boasts, no curses, only sorrow. Some prayed for Artemis. Others looked to the shoreline, hoping the sea would relent. You feel the gravity of that moment, the quiet communion of men who faced the impossible. You ask softly, did anyone try to return to the city afterwards? Corionos nods slowly. We couldn't immediately. The quay was impassable. Boulders the size of carts, splintered timber, live wires of fishing ropes strewn everywhere. The water had flooded every street. We heard bell chimes and thought priests were leading a service. But they were trapped inside the temple. Stones had fallen across the steps. Clitomachos stiffens. My cousin was among them, he says, voice catching. He was a temple acolyte. We tried to clear the rubble, but the stones were too heavy. The aftershocks kept coming. We had to pull back or risk being buried with them. A breeze stirs, cool and salty. Somewhere a dog barks, and a pair of owls answer from the pines above. The fishermen crowd closer, as if drawn into a single heart of memory. Mainstream records note that rescue efforts in Helike were hampered by successive tremors and rising tides, delaying any organized relief for days. It's painful to hear firsthand how those aftershocks ferried fresh peril to every would-be savior. You shift your position, drawing your cloak tighter against the wind. Did any of you see survivors from other towns? You ask. Merchants or travelers passing through? Thessalian's eyes go distant. A handful, he says. A trader from Corinth, a couple of pilgrims from Achaia. They washed in on flotsam, clinging to barrels, half-frozen, dazed. We pulled them in, gave them wine and figs. They talked of the temple's roof torn off, of frescoes flaking like dead skin. He wipes a hand across his brow. They said the amphory vault in the marketplace was smashed, and fish spilled like jewels over the stone, and that one of the triremes broke free, washed all the way to the olive groves before snapping in half. You shiver, imagining the sight. A grand warship, regal and proud, shredded among groves of silvery leaves. Obscure tidbit. Rumors circulated later that one of those trireme splinters was repurposed as a shrine beam in a farmhouse miles inland. Some rural folk claimed it brought them good fortune. Others said it cursed their livestock. Historians are still debating whether these stories stem from real salvage, or simply from travelers spinning yarns by hearthlight. Damocles taps the sand with his toe. We thought the sea had claimed everything. But then, he trails off, gaze flicking to the dark water. Then we saw something in the dawn. You lean forward, breath-catching. What was it? He swallows hard. An island, or at least, a ridge we thought was sea bottom. He spreads his arms. The quake had lifted a section of the seabed, maybe 3 stadia out. It rose like a beach, low and flat, not more than a spear's height above the waterline. Your heart skips. You know that during powerful earthquakes, land can uplift or subside by meters in moments. But here, on this night, that upheaval meant something else. Did people walk out onto it? That we did. Thessalian's eyes shine. We spilled onto the new strand, thinking the gods had made land for us to rebuild. We found entire fish beds left high and dry. Mussels, oysters, even tiny lobsters skittering in the sun. He laughs, but it's trembling. We feasted like kings until the water returned. You imagine the shore transformed into a temporary banquet hall, nets laden with seafood and a sense of divine provision. Obscure note. Similar uplift events are recorded in other Mediterranean quakes, but scholars still debate how widespread such occurrences were and whether local legends exaggerated their scale for dramatic effect. You glance at the others. Koryanos is staring at his lap. What happened when the tide came back? You ask gently. He closes his eyes. It came as a roar. The ridge was swallowed, boats capsized, men lost. We scrambled back to the old huts, but half our feast was gone. And with it, our hope that we could tame the sea. A hush falls, broken only by the distant cry of gulls and the soft lapping of waves. You sip your wine, savoring its salty warmth, and think about how these men cling to each story, not just as testimony to catastrophe, but as a lifeline to a world they loved. Thessalian raises his cup again. We build our lives on water, he says, voice raw. We learn to trust it, make our bargains with it. But that night, the sea broke its promise. Still, we survived. We tell these tales so the next generation remembers, so they know the cost of complacency. You nod, understanding that this is more than nostalgia. It's a warning and a benediction, passed from fisherman to stranger by firelight or moonlight. Mainstream scholars see oral traditions as vital complements to material evidence, capturing moods and details that ruins alone cannot convey. After a long moment, you rise, brushing sand from your knees. Thank you, you say softly, for sharing your stories. They stand too, forming a circle around you. Damocles places a hand on each shoulder. Go, he says, and tell the world what Helike was, how she lived, how she fell, so she won't be forgotten. You bow your head, filled with sorrow and awe. The fishermen step back, blending into the shadows of broken boats and jagged stones. You take a last look at the sea, dark, restless, and never the same again, and turn inland, carrying their stories like a precious cargo. You step onto a soft carpet of parched grass that slopes gently down toward a fenced-off excavation trench. The midday sun hangs high, painting the Mediterranean sky a brilliant blue. Around you, The air tastes of dust and dried time as a team of archaeologists moves deliberately through layers of earth, revealing fragments of a city lost for centuries. This is the site where Helike's buried past is finally uncovered, slice by layer after careful slice. Just beyond the trench, you see a thin horizontal line of pale clay running like a seam through darker soil, an unmistakable marker of where a late Bronze Age settlement once lay. Mainstream scholars credit the 19th century antiquarian William Martin Leake with the first suggestion that ancient Helike might lie buried beneath field and sea, based on stray pieces of pottery and local legends. Yet systematic exploration didn't begin until the 1960s, and the first major underwater surveys only kicked off in the 1980s, when remote sensing technologies like side-scan sonar finally allowed divers to map submerged ruins more accurately. By the turn of the 21st century, Helike's grid of streets, residential quarters, and temple foundations had emerged in astonishing detail, proof that long-lost Helike still lay there, frozen beneath layers of mud and sand. You drop to your knees at the trench's edge, brushing aside loose soil to expose the top of a stone block. It's part of a colonnade foundation, an edge of marble as smooth and cool as ice despite millennia underground. Nearby, a conservator gently lifts the fragment with padded gloves. You watch as she turns it over, revealing the faint impression of a dolphin motif carved into its side. Obscure detail, when these motifs first surfaced, some scholars argued they belonged to a later Hellenistic sanctuary rather than classical Helike, but subsequent stratigraphic analysis confirmed the marble lay directly beneath the Tsunami's silt, dating it firmly to the city's classical heyday. Historians are still debating how the dolphin imagery evolved, whether local artisans copied Corinthian models or developed a distinct Helikean style. As you move along the trench, the soil layers shift visibly beneath your fingertips. At the very top, a thin veneer of 19th century red-brown earth holds fragments of modern bricks and terracotta roof tiles, evidence that local farmers once repurposed Helike's ruins to build barns and farmhouses. Peel back another layer, and you find a darker, almost black stratum dotted with charred wood and ash. A tiny piece of human bone, no larger than a fingernail, glints in the sunlight. Archaeologists explain that this layer corresponds to the night of the earthquake. Buildings burned in spot fires as oil lamps shattered during the tremors, sending sparks through the wooden roofs. That same conflagration blackened stores of grain in the agora, a detail confirmed by charred barley grains recovered in flotation samples. Scholars remain divided on how extensive that fire was. Some argue it was contained to a few blocks, others think it spread across half the city, and debate still rages over whether the fire contributed to the city's rapid abandonment or was simply incidental. You stand and follow the trench down to a layer of pale gray silt, so fine it wafts through the air when disturbed. This is the Tsunami deposit, sand and tiny shell fragments carried inward in a single cataclysmic surge. You note the distinct boundary between the blackened destruction layer above and this gray bed below. The silt contains twisted nails from collapsed doors, shards of amphory, and even fragments of wooden beams now petrified by mineral-rich water. Excavators use gentle brushes and dental picks to tease these items free, each find catalogued, photographed, and wrapped for transport to the conservation lab. Obscure find, one particularly well-preserved amphor neck bore a painted scene of grape harvesters, an image more typical of inland farm estates than coastal workshops, prompting fresh debate about whether Helike's markets ever stocked wine from remote villages or if the vessel drifted in from a shipwreck. Historians still argue whether such amphorae represent direct trade links or chance debris. Beneath the Tsunami layer, the earth turns a warm, ochre hue, filled with the detritus of everyday life. You peer down at shards of loom weights, disc-shaped stones pierced with holes, evidence that Helike's women wove cloth in their homes. Among them, you spot fragments of painted plaster, its pigment still vivid. A swirl of cobalt blue and yellow ochre outlining a stylized fish. Conservators swoop in to lift a larger piece, revealing half a fresco panel depicting a maritime procession. Obscure interpretation. Some argue that this fresco decorated a public building, perhaps a guild hall, while others insist it was part of a private villa's reception room. Scholars continue to debate where such artwork belonged and what it signified to viewers. You stand back as an excavation supervisor taps coordinates into her tablet, logging the location of each find. To your left, two divers emerge from a mobile water-filled trench, their wetsuits dusted with silt. Modern water dredging methods allow them to clear submerged street channels, where narrow stone gutters still carried runoff to the sea. You hear them describe a stretch of mosaic floor they uncovered beneath ankle-deep water. Tesserae in white and dark blue arranged in an interlocking wave pattern. This discovery surprised specialists because it predated known Greek use of polychrome mosaic floors, pushing back the timeline for early flooring techniques. Academic debate now centers on whether this innovation spread from Helike to mainland Greece or vice versa. Meanwhile, a few meters away, a geoarchaeologist holds up a slender core sample encased in a clear cylinder. You peer inside to see alternating bands of organic-rich soil and fine gray layers, each one representing a season, a year, even a decade. By counting these bands, scientists can estimate exactly when the tsunami struck. Seasonally coinciding samples suggest it happened in the winter or early spring. Yet others argue that sediment compaction and bioturbation might skew those counts, leaving open questions about the quake's precise date. Historians still debate whether the tsunami occurred in late winter, when the city was relatively quiet, or in early spring, when festivals might have filled the streets. You wander toward a large dome-shaped mound in the center of the site, what archaeologists call the tell or settlement mound, rising a few meters above the surrounding plain. You're standing atop the city's Neolithic predecessor, its ancient dwellings buried beneath millennia of occupation. At the tell space, researchers have unearthed flint blades and simple pottery vessels dating back to 3000 BCE, evidence that this tiny outcrop hosted human occupation long before Helike's classical splendor. Obscure revelation. Within that prehistoric layer, they found a small clay token stamped with a spiraled snake motif, suggested by some to represent a local deity that predates Artemis herself. Debate continues over whether successive cultures consciously adopted earlier symbols, or if those tokens were simply made by descendants unaware of their origins. As you follow a narrow boardwalk laid across delicate excavation areas, you reach a protective covering over a well-preserved street intersection. Beneath a corrugated metal shelter, two parallel cobbled lanes meet at a right angle, defined by stones set in mortar so precisely they look as if they were cut by modern machines. You can still make out the imprint of ancient wagon wheels, two parallel grooves worn into the stones where merchants rolled their carts. Mainstream studies highlight these grooves as clear evidence of systematic urban planning in Greek port towns, yet Helike's intersection is unusually well preserved. Some scholars attribute this to rapid burial by the tsunami's silt, while others suggest it reflects an exceptionally recent repaving just before the catastrophe. Historians remain divided on whether that pavement replaced an earlier road or was part of ongoing urban renewal efforts. Beyond the intersection, you spot the outline of a large rectangular foundation, the city's stoa, or covered portico, where citizens gathered to conduct business and socialize. Volunteer students brush away debris from a row of column drums, still linked by iron dowels, a testament to the stoa's sturdy construction. On one drum, you notice faint graffiti scratched into the marble, a crudely drawn leaf and the initials K.A. Obscure thought. Some epigraphists argue these marks were a builder's guide, while others see them as the tag of a casual visitor, a bit of ancient street art. Scholars continue to debate whether such graffiti held professional meaning or was simply a pastime of bored townsfolk. You step off the boardwalk and enter a shallow basin where archaeologists are excavating a sequence of hearths, pit structures once used for cooking and small-scale metalworking. One hearth shows telltale slag fragments and droplets of bronze alloy that solidified mid-air, suggesting artisans poured molten metal directly into small molds there. This challenges older assumptions that Helike's metalwork was confined to large workshops. Instead, it reveals a culture of household artisanship. Debate persists over whether such on-site smelting was common or a desperate improvisation during times of heightened demand for tools and weapons. At the excavation camp's edge, artifact registration teams lay out fresh finds on foam mats, bronze fibula pins, carved bone tools, and tiny clay oil lamps decorated with star patterns. You pick up a lamp shaped like a miniature shell. It's so finely made that the ridges feel crisp under your fingertips. The registration sheet lists its context: Layer 4A, Room 2, House C. Even this small lamp tells multiple stories of domestic ritual, of nighttime navigation through dim streets, and of the oil that fueled both practical light and sacred ceremonies. Historians debate whether shell-shaped lamps were merely decorative or if they symbolized maritime protection for households. You wander to a shaded observation platform overlooking a rectangular plot where soil chemists test nutrient levels and magnetic signatures. They explain how elevated phosphorus indicates long-term human occupation, kitchen waste, animal pens, and crop fertilization all leave chemical fingerprints. In Helike's case, unusually high phosphorus near the agora suggests the market stalls also doubled as butchers' shops, with animal scraps piling up over generations. Obscure inference. Some believe those scraps fermented into a primitive fertilizer used on nearby vineyards, making Helike's wine uniquely robust. Scholars continue to debate whether this was deliberate agricultural practice or simply the byproduct of urban life. With your boots dusted by excavated earth, you step back and survey the whole site laid bare before you. The mapped grid of sunken streets, the tell rising like a heartbeat in the center, the scattered marble drums and mosaic fragments waiting to be refitted. You realize how modern methods, GIS mapping, remote sensing radar, underwater photogrammetry, have revolutionized what's possible, turning once mythical ruins into a virtual reconstruction of an ancient city. Yet traditional shovel and trowel excavation remains essential for capturing the human traces that technology alone can't reveal. Finally, you pause at a temporary museum pavilion where the day's best finds are displayed behind glass. A local school group drifts through, pointing at pottery figures of dancers, oversized ceramic amphorae, and slender bronze arrows. A young student tugs at her teacher's sleeve, asking whether those arrows flew in a war or served in a hunting ritual. The teacher smiles and says, "Maybe both. It depends on the story you believe." In that moment, you sense that Helike's rediscovery is not just about stone and clay, but about rekindling a dialogue between past and present. You step outside the pavilion into the warm breeze, letting the sounds of shovels and brushes drift behind you. The sun dips lower, gilding the exposed ruins with a soft glow. You tuck your notebook away, heart full of the countless voices unearthed in these layers. The farmers who built upon old stones, the craftsmen who left dolphin motifs, the victims of a single night's terror, and the modern archaeologists piecing it all together. As you walk away down the dusty path, the horizon stretches wide, and you carry with you the deep sense that buried beneath the plain, Helike still lives, layer upon layer of human hands and hopes waiting for the next generation to uncover their stories. Historians may debate the details, but you know that in every brick, every shard, and every grain of silt, the essence of Helike endures, whispering across millennia that even a city swept away can rise again in memory and in stone. You step onto the elevated wooden walkway that skirts the edge of the excavation area, the late afternoon sun warming the boards beneath your sandals. A gentle breeze stirs loose sediment, carrying the faint sound of shovels tapping and trowels scratching through earth. Around you, a dozen experts cluster in animated discussion, their voices weaving a tapestry of competing theories. This is the hot zone of Helike's rediscovery, the arena where every stone, shard, and scent of soil sparks fierce debate. Ahead, an open trench reveals what some say is the city's original harbor wall, a series of massive limestone blocks standing half-buried in dark silt. A tall, bespectacled archaeologist named Dr. Philippides gestures at the blocks with a pointing stick, his voice carrying authority. "These courses of masonry," he says, "are unmistakably Hellenistic. Look at the drafted margins and draft-chiseled surfaces, techniques not in use before the late 4th century BCE. He waves his hand toward another expert, Dr. Marlowe, who furrows his brow and shakes his head. "You're mistaken," Marlowe counters. "Draft chiseling became popular here earlier than in mainland Greece. We found examples in Corinth. Plus, the stratigraphy shows these blocks rest directly on the tsunami layer, classical Helike's destruction deposit. So they must belong to the original city, not a later rebuild." He taps the exposed silt gently with a brush, scattering fine particles. "If your Hellenistic date were correct, we'd see an intermediate occupation layer above the tsunami bed. We don't." You lean against the railing, listening as the two scholars volley evidence and counter-evidence. Behind them, a trio of geoarchaeologists consults ground-penetrating radar images on a tablet, fussing with brightness and contrast. They're trying to reconcile those scans with what Philippides calls in situ proof. One woman points to a radar shadow that outlines a submerged quay extending under remaining limestone blocks. This feature, she asserts, matches the harbor's curvature described in ancient texts, meaning those blocks are in their original positions. But her colleague, a man in a floppy sun hat, argues the curve could be natural topography, a relic of an ancient riverbank rather than a man-made pier. You notice Dr. Vento, a maritime archaeologist, hovering at the fringe of the trench, arms crossed. He's scribbling notes and occasionally launching into side debates with younger team members about whether the term harbor here refers to a full naval dockyard or merely a sheltered mooring bay. You catch him mutter under his breath, "If only they'd bring a boat here and prove once and for all that these stones were meant to hold ships." Meanwhile, a stonemason working nearby raises a chipped fragment of column drum for the group to see. "Look at this," he says. "You can still see the groove where the lead dowel Saturday." Philippides nods sagely. "Yes, very telling. Lead dowels of this diameter suggest monumental columns, likely part of a stoa or temple. That points to public architecture, not harbor walls." Marlowe steps forward, placing a hand on the fragment. "Or it could be part of a protective breakwater that doubled as a promenade." Helike's waterfront was civic space as much as a shipping hub. Every half-minute, a new voice breaks in. Anthropologists debate whether human burials found nearby belong to sea gods' cult sacrifices or to ordinary citizens who perished in the earthquake. A lithe postdoc argues that the skeleton's orientation toward the sea suggests ritual placement. A senior osteologist counters, "Look at the cut marks. These are clearly rescue burials, hurried and unceremonious, mingling victims in family plots and communal pits. You can almost feel the undercurrent of passion. This isn't just rocks and bones. It's identity, heritage, and the right to tell Helike's story." You drift along the walkway to a section where students unearth painted plaster fragments from a collapsed wall. One fragment shows the delicate curve of an arching wave, another the tip of a lotus rosette. The students whisper excitedly, "This is unique iconography," you overhear one say. Philippides strides over, leaning in. "Most of these fragments match known Corinthian workshops. See the pigment mix, ground malachite and Egyptian blue. That combination suggests imported dyes, a luxury. This building was probably an elite residence." Dr. Marlowe appears again, shaking his head. "Or it could be part of the council house. Symbols of waves and lotus were as much civic as private. Temples used them too." He gestures toward a cluster of column bases further down the trench, each bearing the same fish motif. Public buildings had repeated motifs. Private homes did not. Philippides crosses his arms. "Then why did we find fragments of civic decrees inscribed on marble plaques in the same collapse?" Marlowe shrugs. "Possibly recycled from an earlier structure." Nearby, a ceramic specialist kneels beside a scattering of amphora shards. She picks up a piece painted with a wine harvest scene, workers treading grapes beneath a grapevine canopy. "This looks Achaean," she tells a colleague. "Likely from inland estates, not local Helikean workshops." A numismatist leans in, holding a clay weight stamped with a stylized trident. "These weights are die-stamped, not hand-impressed. That suggests an official mint." Helike minted its own weights around 330 BCE, but some argue those tokens were later adaptations of Corinthian standards. The specialist replies, "But watch this glaze." She rubs the fragment's surface. It's a natron glaze, rare in mainland potteries, more common in Peloponnesian imports. "I date this amphora to around 350 BCE. The numismatist raises an eyebrow. "Then why does the clay composition match local sediment samples?" More huddled whispers. You walk to a spot where geoarchaeologists are carefully monitoring a borehole sample. They've extracted a cylindrical core that, when peeled away, reveals a dozen distinct layers of soil and silt. One scientist points out a thin band of charcoal, evidence of the city's fires. Another traces a clay lens, an earlier flood deposit. They debate whether that flood was minor or a precursor to the 373 BCE tsunami. Could be a small storm surge, one suggests, or a tremor-induced seiche, counters another. Without microfossil analysis, we can't know. They scribble on clipboards, eyes bright with inquiry. As the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows across the trench, you notice a small group gathered around a GPS station. They're overlaying current drone imagery onto an ancient map, seeking alignment between modern topography and historical cartography. Some lines converge neatly, others diverge by meters. A GIS analyst exclaims, "This suggests the coastline shifted eastward by at least 50 meters since classical times." An environmental archaeologist snorts, "Or our reference points are off. Subsidence and sediment compaction will skew your vertical datum." They huddle over laptops, scrolling maps, adjusting base maps, layering contours, each tweak met with nods or grimaces. You slide down a ladder into a narrower pit where osteologists examine skeletal remains. Several burials lie in stratified order, some cut into the tsunami silt, others beneath it. A forensic anthropologist delicately brushes soil from a pelvis. This individual shows signs of perimortem trauma, sharp force cut marks. Might indicate violence during the panic. A bioarchaeologist peers through a magnifying glass. Or trampling wounds as the quake struck. We need microscopic enamel analysis to differentiate. The forensic expert counters. Bone microstructure will reveal ballistic versus crush fractures. Let's not jump to conclusions. They jostle for lab access, voices rising. At the trench's far end, a small team uncovers a stone threshold bearing a carved inscription. Partial letters forming the words, "Clees of Helike." Everyone fusses around it. One scholar declares, "This seals the identification of this building as belonging to Helike proper." Another sighs, "But we only have 4 letters. Could be a dedication to someone, Clees from nearby Pullini, not Helike." Arguments burst out again. Philologists challenge epigraphers, who challenge stratigraphers, who challenge historians. You realize how every technical detail, stone tool marks, pigment composition, layer thickness, feeds into a broader narrative about what Helike was and who its people were. You lean back and close your eyes for a moment, breathing in the tang of disturbed earth. The sun dips lower, bathing the site in molten gold. A crow caws from a distant olive grove, and you feel the pulse of Helike's past vibrating in the quiet between debates. All around you, questions swirl. Was this harbor wall part of the original city or a later repair? Did those columns line a temple or a stoa? Were the painted frescoes civic adornments or private luxuries? How many lives did the quake swallow, and how many did the sea reclaim? Historians are still debating every one of these points. You notice Dr. Philippides beckoning you over, a smile breaking through his scholarly sternness. "Come see this," he says, offering you the carved fragment of a column base with a delicate wave pattern. "No draft margins here, this is clearly earlier work. I concede, perhaps not Hellenistic after all." Before you can reply, Dr. Marlowe swoops in, holding a tiny shard of polished pottery. "And look at this handle shape. I'd say 375 BCE at the latest," he says triumphantly. "So it must belong to the original settlement." Philippides laughs and shakes his head. "Then why does the clay grain match samples from layers dated to the 3rd century BCE? He counters. "Maybe Helike's clay pit remained in use for centuries," Marlowe replies. "But that raises questions about resource management we haven't fully worked out." They turn back to the trench, brimming with the energy of scholarly sparring as the last rays of sun fade. You step away from the edge, heart racing with excitement and a touch of fatigue. The wooden walkway creaks underfoot as you make your way back toward solid ground. Behind you, the experts continue their animated discourse, hypotheses ricocheting across the open sky like sparrows in a grove. You pause at the site's perimeter, eyes scanning the exposed ruins one last time. Broken blocks, half-buried column drums, mosaic fragments, and slender hints of painted walls. This is where theories take shape, dissolve, and reshape again. Where the story of Helike emerges not as a single narrative, but as a chorus of voices, each layer of earth and each fragment of pottery adding nuance and color. As the stars begin to twinkle overhead, you feel the weight of all these debates settle into something profound. The knowledge that Helike's true story will never be fixed in stone, just as its stones never stayed fixed on the shore. Instead, its legacy lives on in the questions that refuse to settle, in the dialogue between past and present. And you, for one, are grateful to bear witness to this restless unraveling, knowing that tomorrow, new clues will surface, new theories will ignite, and the spirited quest to understand Helike will march on. You stand on the sun-browned deck of a creaky brigantine as it weaves through morning mist toward the shallow inlet where Helike once stood. A gust of salt-laced wind rattles the rigging above you, and the sea yawns wide around the prow, rippling with hidden currents. Across the deck you see our Stevens, dapper in a dark frock coat and wide-brimmed hat, leaning forward over a large rolled parchment, his quill poised like a duelist's rapier. This is July of 1861, and you're about to witness the first modern attempt to unearth the sunken city of Helike. Stevens glances up, his spectacles catching fleeting glints of dawn. "Steady there," he says, voice measured but tense. "If legend holds true, we'll find marble fragments wedged in that silt bank." You feel the rhythm of his confidence, tempered by the hush of uncertainty all explorers know. Will this myth yield tangible proof, or will it elude you both once again? The boat shudders to a halt as you enter the inlet marked on Stevens's rough navigational chart. What looks like nothing more than a shallow lagoon hides the graveyard of an entire city. You step off the plank onto knee-deep water that shimmers with brown-green haze. Stevens strides beside you, cane in hand, boots crunching on oyster-encrusted stones. He stops at a cluster of submerged column drums, worn smooth by tide and time. He kneels, fingers trailing over a spiral fluting. "By Jove," he whispers. "This cannot be coincidence." You lean in, heart racing as you brush away silt with a small trowel. White marble peeks through, streaked with barnacles and algae. You lift a fragment, a piece of what once was a Doric shaft, and hold it aloft. It's cold and weighty, each groove carved by hands long gone. For a moment you feel the tremor of history beneath your fingertips. Stevens laughs softly, as if sharing a private triumph. He extracts a small brass compass from his pocket and jots coordinates on his chart. "I'll sketch this before it's lost to the tide," he says. You fetch a waterproof notebook, ink already smudging at the edges, and record the find alongside his own meticulous notes. These are the first tangible clues that Helike lies beneath these waters, waiting for patient hands to coax it free. Mainstream antiquarians of the era greeted Stevens's venture with skepticism. Many believed Helike was purely legendary, a coastal village swallowed whole like a Greek fairy tale, leaving no trace behind. But Stevens was undeterred by naysayers. He had heard local fishermen's whispers of marble fragments caught in their nets and so followed those murmurings, convinced that oral tradition sometimes carries the heaviest truths. You grin at his stubbornness. You know that every meaningful discovery in archaeology began with someone willing to look where others refused. As the sun climbs, Stevens organizes a makeshift camp on the beach. You help erect striped canvas tents and haul wooden crates ashore, each crate filled with hammers, chisels, measuring rods, and an assortment of specimen jars. Among them, a curious item catches your eye. A small glass vial labeled sea urchin spines, potential artifacts? Stevens catches your glance and smirks. "One local told me these spines were bones of the drowned. Thought perhaps they marked ancient burials," he explains. "Preposterous, of course, but I prefer a cautious approach." You tuck the vial in your coat pocket, an odd keepsake to remind you that sometimes the oddest hints lead to the richest finds. By midday, Stevens has delineated a grid along the shoreline, marking squares with numbered flags. You kneel in square B3, trowel in one hand, brush in the other, painstakingly removing layers of sand and gravel. Each sweep reveals broken pieces of amphora, bits of tile, and occasional fragments of carved marble. You uncover a pottery shard painted with a dancing satyr, its curling vine motif unusually vibrant. You pass it to Stevens, who examines it through a pair of brass-rimmed magnifiers. "Look at the precision," he murmurs. "Not the coarse work of seaside villagers, but the hand of a skilled craftsman." He pops the shard into a padded box, ready for transport. Nearby, your colleague, a young graduate named Eleonora, uncovers a lead seal stamped with the image of a trident. She holds it triumphantly, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Trident of Poseidon," she breathes. "Could this be a marker for temple offerings?" You glance at Stevens, whose eyes gleam. "This is most promising," he says. "A connection to Poseidon, yes, though we mustn't leap to conclusions. Such seals were used for trade as much as ritual." Already, you sense the swirl of interpretation that will follow every small find. As afternoon shadows lengthen, Stevens convenes a brief meeting under the shade of an olive tree still clinging to the eroded shore. He pulls you aside. "I intend to dig a deeper trench here," he says, pointing at a spot near a cluster of partially submerged column drums. "If we cut beneath the alluvial buildup, we might find preserved structures. Floors, thresholds, perhaps even inscriptions." You nod, ready to begin the laborious task of trenching. Little do you realize the backbreaking toil that awaits, scooping heavy, waterlogged sediment under a relentless sun, all while keeping meticulous records. The first shovelful yields a smear of dark earth flecked with shell fragments, a possible coastal landfill left by the Greek inhabitants. Hours later, your shovel strikes something solid. A rectangular block of stone lying beneath sediment and tangled seaweed roots. You clear the surrounding sand to reveal a carved inscription in faint Greek letters. "Lambda Caparata," you whisper, tracing the half-legible text. Eleonora gasps. Stevens kneels beside you, dusting away the last of the silt. "Helike," he says, voice hushed. "We have our city." For a heartbeat, the world seems to stand still as you share a genuine moment of discovery. Proof that myth and history converge in that single word. Obscure anecdote. Shortly after that inscription emerged, a stray dog wandered from the nearby coastal village into the camp, spotted the carved stone, and urinated on it. An act that irreparably stained part of the inscription. Stevens recorded the mishap with rueful humor in his journal, noting that even canines seek to leave their mark upon history. The stain remained visible in early photographs, leading some later historians to misread the damaged letters and propose alternate site names. Scholars are still debating whether the misinterpretation ever significantly altered the understanding of the site's identity. Over the next few days, you and the team establish a rhythm. At dawn, you measure sea levels and note tidal changes. By mid-morning, you labor in the trench. Afternoons are for washing finds, cataloging, and sketching plans. Evenings belong to the campfire, where Stevens reads aloud from Pausanias and Strabo, comparing their descriptions of Helike to your fresh observations. Each night, you lie in your canvas tent, head buzzing with the day's revelations, eager for the next sunrise. One notable evening, Stevens arranges a small dinner of salted fish and bread and pours a modest cup of wine for each of you. He stands and raises his goblet. "To Helike," he proclaims, "may her stones speak once more." He pauses, adjusting his hat, and adds with a wry smile, "And to the sea urchins, if they're ever more than superstitious relics." The others laugh, clinking their cups against his, even as the sea breeze threatens to extinguish the lone lantern flame. Midway through the season, news arrives of funding complications back in London. The Royal Society hints that Stevens may need to curtail his expedition if he cannot secure additional backers. You watch him stare out at the tranquil inlet, his jaw set. That night, he pores over telegraphs and letters by lamplight, negotiating with patrons to sustain the dig. You admire his tenacity. You know that in archaeology, half the battle is not finding ruins but staying in the field long enough to unearth their secrets. Just as momentum carries you forward, the unplanned happens. One morning, after a heavy overnight storm, you emerge to find half your trench flooded with murky water. Wooden supports have collapsed, and delicate finds lie submerged in oily silt. A shout goes up, "Protection's failed. All must retreat." For a moment you feel panic. precious artifacts are at risk. Then Stevens barks orders. Sandbags here, boards there, pumps to remove water. Under his command, the team works feverishly, hauling makeshift barriers and bailing water by hand until the trench emerges once more, tired but intact. That day, you learn the hard lesson that archaeology is as much about battling nature as it is about interpreting the past. By late August, Stevens's journals record over 100 catalogued finds. Column fragments, pottery shards, seals, coins, and that irreplaceable stone bearing Helike's name. He arranges for crates to be shipped to Athens and, from there, onward to London, hoping these artifacts will vindicate his efforts before learned societies. You help pack them carefully in straw, each labeled with grid coordinates and context descriptions, aware that each crate carries not just relics but the credibility of your entire expedition. On Stevens's final night, he hosts a small ceremony on the beach. Torches flicker along the waterline, casting wavering orange light across the surf. He invites each team member forward to speak their hopes for the site. When it's your turn, you step before the glowing circle, heart pounding. "I hope," you say, voice clear, "that Helike's story inspires future generations, scholars, dreamers, and fishermen alike, to remember that beneath myth lies truth, waiting to be found." The assembled team cheers, and the torches' flames bow in the sea breeze, as if acknowledging your words. At dawn, you watch the brigantine's sails unfurl, Stevens at the helm, chart in hand. You wave from the beach as the ship glides away, its wake dissolving in the glassy inlet. You carry with you a battered notebook, a tobacco-stained frock coat sleeve, Stevens's inadvertent gift when he thrust you aside to see a delicate coin, and the knowledge that you were among the few to witness Helike's modern resurrection. In the years that follow, some of those crates bear jewels to museums. Others collect dust in obscure halls. Publications appear, some praising Stevens's triumphs, others criticizing his methods as too hasty or his interpretations too eager. A handful of academic papers even question whether the inscribed stone truly read Helike at all, suggesting alternate readings based on early photographs. Historians are still debating the precise identity of those 19th century finds and the accuracy of Stevens's field notes. But for you, those weeks on that inlet stand as proof that tenacity, curiosity, and a bit of well-timed stubbornness can coax a city out of the sea. And every so often, when you run a finger along a half-buried column remnant or unearth another piece of polished pottery, you smile, knowing you stood at the beginning of Helike's modern revival. You stand on the polished deck of a research vessel equipped with sonar arrays, underwater drones, and a small submersible, gazing down at the glassy surface of the Corinthian Gulf. The sky overhead is steel gray and the breeze carries the faint hum of engines and the tang of sea spray. This is 2024, and you're about to see how 21st century technology is breathing life into the ruins of Helike, that legendary city once swallowed by earthquake and tsunami. Beneath you, a mapping sonar pings steadily, sending out arcs of sound that trace the contours of the seabed. A screensaver of multicolored lines appears on a nearby monitor, each hue denoting depth, density, or an object detected on the bottom. You lean forward, tapping at the touchscreen to zoom in on a series of rectangular shadows aligned in a neat row. These shapes weren't visible in earlier surveys. They hint at a submerged street or colonnade. Mainstream marine archaeologists now agree that high-resolution side-scan sonar has revolutionized site mapping, allowing us to chart entire underwater cityscapes without disturbing a grain of silt. To your right, an operator pilots a small work-class ROV, remotely operated vehicle, fitted with LED lights and a high-definition camera. You watch its flickering feed, the black water suddenly lit by sharp beams, revealing chunked columns, half-buried walls, and large pieces of mosaic floor scattered across the sand. A crust of sponges and sea urchins encrusts every surface, testament to centuries of marine colonization. Obscure detail. Some marine biologists note that certain sponge species attach preferentially to marble rather than limestone, making them inadvertent markers for archaeologists seeking classical Greek structures. Historians are still debating whether the sponge's presence and the damage it causes should be considered part of the site's ongoing biography or treated as mere natural degradation. You slip into a motion-stabilized aluminum submersible, its viewport barely larger than a porthole yet offering a fisheye panorama of the sunken city. The pilot, a slim woman in a bright orange wetsuit, guides you down until you settle 2 meters above a mosaic floor. Thousands of tesserae, tiny cubes of marble, glass, and ceramic, form an intricate wave pattern, nearly intact despite the passing centuries. The sheets were laid without mortar, held in place by a thin silt layer that has preserved them like a time capsule. According to conservation reports, Helike's underwater mosaics are among the best preserved examples of late classical craftsmanship, rivaling those in open-sea shipwrecks off Sicily. From your vantage point, you can make out a rectangular threshold, 3 steps descending into what must have been a public hall or bathhouse. You recall that ancient texts mention public baths in Helike where sailors washed off the salt before entering the temple precinct. Yet no ruins on land hinted at their location. Only now, with sub-bottom profiling, does their presence come into focus. Researchers still debate whether these baths used warm water heated by nearby thermal springs or simply offered cold seawater cisterns to refresh travelers. Either way, it's clear that Helike's civic infrastructure was more complex than previously thought. You press a button on the sub's console, and the pilot activates a gripper arm. It reaches out, brushing aside silt to reveal a piece of painted plaster, still clinging to a fallen wall fragment. The swirling red and black lines portray a dancing Maenad, her tunic billowing in a style reminiscent of Corinthian vase painting. A fluoroscope then scans the plaster's layers, revealing underdrawings, preliminary sketches that artists used to plan their frescoes. Obscure insight, those underdrawings display corrections and overwritten motifs, showing that painters sometimes improvise their composition on the fly, rather than strictly following a master template. Scholars are still debating whether such improvisation was common in classical Greek mural art or a local Helikean quirk born of limited resources. Back on deck, you gather around a portable 3D printer fed by a digital scan file. The printer hums and extrudes fine limestone powder filament, layering it with precision to recreate a tiny column fragment you lifted from the hull of the sub earlier. Within minutes, a faithful replica, complete with its fluted surface and lead dowel hole, sits beside the original. Mainstream conservators now use such replicas to test restoration hypotheses, ensuring that no original fragment ever leaves the water. Yet some preservation purists argue that even digital reproductions risk encouraging over-extraction, prompting heated debates at conferences about virtual versus material authenticity. Historians are still debating whether digital replicas should carry the same interpretative weight as original artifacts. A tech specialist fires up a VR headset and gestures for you to don it. Instantly, you're immersed in a reconstructed Helike marketplace. Tablet in hand, you navigate through stalls laden with amphorae, fish, and fruits. Virtual crowds chatter in ancient Doric Greek, and the sun arcs overhead, casting lifelike shadows. You pass between virtual columns the very height you measured on the ocean floor, their capitals detailed with lotus rosettes. This VR experience draws on GIS data, sonar maps, and site reports to offer an interactive glimpse of daily life. Obscure nuance. Early user tests showed that participants tended to remember topographical details more vividly than social narratives when exploring VR reconstructions, raising questions about whether VR helps or hinders holistic historical understanding. Scholars are still debating the pedagogical efficacy of immersive simulations. The VR session ends, and you step aside to inspect a drone footage loop on a laptop. A quadcopter crisscrossed the shoreline at dawn, capturing the faint outline of sunken street patterns revealed at low tide. Analysts overlaid those aerial shots with LiDAR scans of the surrounding hills, creating a geospatial model that traces Helike's ancient limits both above and below water. On the display, you see an interactive map toggling layers, land elevation, submerged ruins, thermal spring sources, and even probable earthquake fault lines. It's a visual symphony of data points converging on a single grid, giving you unprecedented confidence in your site interpretation. Yet as you marvel at the model, you remember that data seldom agrees perfectly. The LiDAR topography shows a ridge that suggests Helike's walls once curved farther north than ancient writers claimed, a discrepancy that fuels ongoing debate about the city's true footprint. Some topographers argue that later sediment deposits have reshaped the modern shoreline, while others suggest that ancient authors exaggerated distances to glorify Helike's defenses. Historians are still debating which account to trust. You leave the tech hub and stride toward a small platform where a geologist holds a sample, a fist-sized chunk of compacted silt drawn from a seabed core. Through a portable microscope, you see tiny foraminifera shells and mineral grains aligned in horizontal bands. The geologist explains how radiocarbon dating of organic matter in these bands helps pinpoint the tsunami's timing within a few decades. Yet she cautions that bioturbation, animal activity in the sediment, can blur those dates, and without cross-checking with tree data from nearby submerged groves, the chronology remains tentative. Precision is a moving target, she says, but even an approximate date lets us link Helike's end to wider Aegean events, like political upheavals in Corinth. Scholars are still debating whether Helike's destruction influenced regional power dynamics or was simply a tragic footnote. Nearby, a cluster of marine biologists studies samples of barnacle species scraped from a column fragment. They catalog the species present, some common to the Gulf, others invasive species introduced in the last century. By analyzing which species colonized when, they can estimate how fast the ruins accumulated marine life, offering a biological clock for the site's post-destruction timeline. Obscure observation. Certain barnacle larvae attach preferentially to rougher marble, leaving smooth surfaces uncolonized, a quirk that helped identify undocumented repairs on 19th century structures. Historians are still debating whether such bioindicators can reliably substitute for traditional archaeological dating methods. In the back of the deck, students cluster around a touchscreen terminal displaying participatory maps. Local volunteers and schoolchildren have dropped virtual pins indicating family stories passed down through generations. Tales of a ghost fish market, seen at low tide, or an old cistern uncovered during a gardener's dig in the 1950s. These crowdsourced memories blend with academic data, creating a living archive of Helike's cultural resonance. Obscure note. While such oral history projects enrich the narrative, folklorists caution that memories can mutate over time, blending fact and fiction. Historians are still debating how to weight oral tradition against material evidence. As the afternoon sun shifts, you reboard the submersible for a final dive to a recently discovered side street. The pilot carefully navigates a narrow channel between two submerged walls. Your lights pick out a threshold carved with a relief of dolphins and waves, an unmistakable Helikean signature. Nearby, you spot a small amphora intact except for a chipped handle. With a gentle suction device, the ROV secures the jar for careful recovery. Back on deck, you cradle it in foam, marveling at the unbroken painted vine that encircles its neck. Such finds are rare, you note. Most amphorae here break under the tsunami's force or crumble beneath marine organisms. You pause to rest your elbows on the railing, breathing in the electric energy of the ship and the scent of the sea. Around you, scientists, technicians, and students chatter about data anomalies, phantom sonar echoes, and the latest 3D reconstructions. You feel the thrill of discovery, but also the weight of responsibility. Modern tools have unveiled wonders, but they also raise new questions. How much should we interfere with a site that has become an artificial reef and a crucial marine habitat? To what extent do digital reconstructions risk substituting experience for authentic engagement? Can we ever truly recapture Helike's pulse? Or will it always be an echo of layered interpretations? As the golden hour approaches, you join the team for a final debrief in the lab on board. Maps, charts, and VR headsets are scattered across tables. People speak in overlapping bursts, calibration challenges, future dive plans, publication deadlines. You listen, scribbling notes, aware that today's accomplishments will be tomorrow's footnotes in academic journals. And yet, there's exhilaration in knowing that with every sonar ping and every pixel rendered, Helike's story grows richer, more nuanced, and more alive. Before you step ashore on the mainland, you turn back to gaze at the research vessel's wake trailing into the setting sun. You realize that modern technology hasn't simply mapped Helike. It's transformed how you think about ancient cities. The digital and the material, the human and the marine, the scientific and the speculative, all have merged in a dynamic interplay. Historians are still debating which branch of science will yield the next breakthrough. But you know one thing for certain. Beneath these waves, Helike endures, and with every probe, scan, and dive, you come closer to unlocking the secrets of a city once lost to catastrophe and now reborn in data, in digital light, and in human imagination. You walk the narrow cobblestone path one last time, moonlight shimmering on the uneven stones beneath your feet. The city you knew, helmed by merchants, echoing with hymns to Artemis, alive with the crackle of kiln fires, has dissolved into memory and mud. Yet as you tread through these whispers of the past, you realize Helike is no longer just a place. It has become a dream woven from fragments of stone, song, and sea. You pause at the edge of the old harbor, where a single column drum lies half buried in sand. You rest your hand on its fluted surface, feeling the grooves carved by craftsmen generations ago. Mainstream scholars assert that this very harbor served as the principal naval base of the Achaean League in the 4th century BCE, anchoring Helike's political and military influence on the Corinthian Gulf. You let that knowledge settle in your mind, grounding your reverie in concrete history. Above you, stars scatter across the sky like scattered tesserae from a vast mosaic. You imagine how artisans once laid those tiles in homes just like this spot became your evening's canvas. Then, you recall an obscure detail shared by a marine biologist earlier, a species of sponge that clings predominantly to marble over limestone, inadvertently marking classical foundations beneath the waves. You smile at the thought that even living creatures join in preserving Helike's story, painting its outlines in living filaments. You take a deep breath, tasting salt and thyme. In your mind's eye, the city unfolds around you in layers. The marketplace alive with calls of fishmongers, the hush of incense in the temple, the clink of trireme oars at dawn. You see the artisan districts glow, kiln fires sputtering embers against twilight. You hear the tavern's laughter, wild as the surf. You feel the secret cavern's hushed sacredness, droplets of seawater tapping a primal rhythm. And yet, amid this vivid tapestry, you sense ambiguity. Scholars continue to debate whether the city's seawalls dated to classical Helike or a later Hellenistic rebuild, whether the painted plaster fragments adorned civic council halls or private villas. These unresolved questions hang in the air like half-spoken prayers, inviting you to fill the gaps with your own wonder. You step into the shallow water, moonlight dancing on its gentle ripples. This gulf once swallowed Helike in one cataclysmic night. First the quake, then the tsunami's roar. Yet here you stand, witness to its enduring breath. You let the water lap at your ankles and close your eyes. In that hush, every echo of the city swirls together. The slap of oars, the ring of temple bells, the hammer of chisels, the hush of sand shifting underwater. You raise your arms, as though cradling the entire city in an embrace. You feel the pull of gravity and the pull of memory, equal and opposite. Helike was lost, but it lived on in fresco shards, in mosaic patterns, in stirred sediment, and in the dreams of those who sought its shores. You realize that by dreaming Helike back to life, you become part of its story. Now, as you turn to leave, you cast one final glance across the bay. The moon tilts behind a drifting cloud, and the water glimmers like molten silver. You promise yourself that this dream will not fade. You will carry Helike's spirit into every tide, every whisper of limestone wind, every star that pierces the dark. You drift away from the moonlit shore, each step lighter than the last, as if the city's burdens have sloughed off with the tide. The soft susurrus of gentle waves follows you, guiding you beyond broken columns and scattered tiles, into a realm where reality and reverie merge. Your breathing slows, matching the sea's steady pulse, and you sense that Helike's heartbeat has found a place within your own. The night air grows cooler, cradling you in its embrace. Stars waver overhead, their light twinkling like a lullaby. You close your eyes and feel the warmth of ancient hearths, the murmur of evening prayers, the hushed laughter of friends gathered at sunset. Each memory stretches, elongates, until it becomes a gentle hum at the edge of your consciousness. In this tranquil moment, time unravels. Past and present fold together, and you drift on a cushion of salt and wonder. You are both traveler and dreamer, one who once sought the city's stones and now carries its spirit into sleep. There is no rush, only the soft cadence of exhalations, the sigh of wind through olive leaves, the distant echo of commerce and ceremony, now hushed to a whisper. You feel your eyelids grow heavy, each blink a wave receding, drawing you closer to that borderland between waking and dreaming. In that tender twilight, Helike emerges one last time, not as ruins beneath water, but as a tapestry woven from hope and memory. You imagine its streets alive once more, lit by lamp and laughter. And you know that wherever you go, the city's essence travels with you. Now, as you sink into sleep, let the ruins dissolve into gentle currents. Let the columns fade into starlight. Let the temple's hush become your own. You are safe on this shore of dreams, embraced by the whispering waves.